When I was 17, I spent that summer at my grandfather Robert's place in the West Virginia mountains. His house sat just below a long wooded ridge, thick with maples and white pines. It was the kind of place where the wind made a sound through the trees that almost covered everything else. No cell service, no streetlights, and no other houses in sight. Just deer trails and old dirt roads that went nowhere fast. Grandpa had lived there nearly his whole life and claimed to know every inch of the land. He still hunted and fished on foot, never using GPS, and often came back with stories about the Ridge people, descendants of settlers who, according to him, still lived deep in those hills and avoided town at all costs. He'd tell me they kept to themselves, didn't trust outsiders, and never used phones, electricity, or even cars. I always thought it was just something he made up to mess with me, especially when I was little. That summer, I was staying in his guest room while helping him clear brush, repaint the shed, and fix a bit of fence. It was peaceful for the most part, and I spent my downtime sitting on the porch, reading old paperbacks or texting friends when I could get a signal in town. About 2 weeks into my stay, my friends Ryan and Kate came up from Charleston to visit. We'd planned it in advance and Grandpa didn't mind. He liked Kate and said Ryan reminded him of himself at our age, whatever that meant. It was the second evening after they arrived, and we were all sitting on the back steps watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The air smelled like pine and fresh dirt. Ryan suggested we play a game of hide and seek, but with a twist. Instead of playing around the house, he wanted to take it into the woods. I hesitated, but Kate was into the idea and said she wanted something more exciting than sitting around talking. Grandpa was already in bed by then, so we didn't think he'd notice if we were gone for an hour or two. We grabbed a couple of flashlights and headed up the hill behind the house. The trail started narrow but widened a bit after the first 100 feet. We'd gone hiking that morning, so we had a general idea of the layout. The rules were simple. Kate would count, and Ryan and I would hide somewhere up the slope. After 10 minutes, she'd come looking. She started counting near the base of an old oak tree while Ryan and I took off into the brush. We ended up about 100 yards up the hill, crouching behind a thick patch of mountain laurel. It wasn't perfect cover, but with the moonlight filtering through the trees and the sounds of the forest all around, it felt like we'd picked a decent spot. We both settled in to wait, whispering jokes and shushing each other whenever we heard a branch snap. Then 10 minutes passed. Then 15. I checked my phone, but of course, no service. "Where the hell is she?" Ryan muttered, shifting beside me. I didn't answer. Something about the air had changed. The breeze had died down and the woods felt too quiet. No crickets, no rustling. Just this stillness that made my skin prickle. That's when I heard it. Faint at first, like someone tapping a rhythm on wood. Then it shifted, deepened into something more organized. Drumming. It wasn't the kind of sound a deer or raccoon would make. It had a pattern, a cadence. Ryan turned to me, eyebrows up. "You hear that?" I nodded, listening harder. There was more to it now. A low humming that almost sounded like singing, mixed with something high-pitched, almost like pipes. It wasn't music I recognized. It reminded me of bagpipes, but rougher, more distorted by distance and trees. We stayed still, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Ryan leaned in and whispered, "That's not Kate. That's like a whole bunch of people." The drumming got louder, steadier. Voices now, no doubt about it. Not shouting, just chanting maybe? Singing in a language I didn't recognize. Ryan and I crouched lower, pressing ourselves into the undergrowth. I scanned the dark between the trees, expecting to see flashlights or some glow, but there was nothing. Just those sounds, getting closer. "You think it's like some ceremony?" Ryan whispered, eyes wide. I didn't answer, but I was thinking the same thing. Grandpa's stories came rushing back all at once. The ridge people. The ones who lived off the land and avoided outsiders. People who'd been out here long before the roads were paved and didn't want anything to do with modern life. I reached out and grabbed Ryan's arm. "Don't move," I said, just above a whisper. The music was surrounding us now. Not above us on the ridge, not below, just around. Like it was echoing through the woods without a clear direction. And it was getting clearer, not louder. Like the air itself was carrying it better as the night went on. Ryan's hand was clenched tight on his flashlight, but he didn't turn it on. We both knew better. Whatever was out there, we didn't want them to see us. Still crouched in the brush, I strained to hear if Kate was anywhere nearby, maybe calling out, maybe looking for us. But there was nothing. No voice, no footsteps. Just the steady rise and fall of those strange old sounds from deeper in the forest. Panic hit us both at the same time. Ryan grabbed my sleeve and pulled, and we ran, full speed, crashing through the brush downhill. The forest wasn't silent anymore. The strange music echoed through the trees, steady, rhythmic, unreal. Branches slapped our faces and tore at our legs, but we didn't stop. I stumbled once on a root and nearly went down, but Ryan caught me and yanked me forward. Neither of us said a word. Our focus was just getting back to the house. The trail wasn't clear anymore. We overshot it, then corrected, cutting between trees we didn't recognize. The air felt tighter, colder, like we were being chased even though no one was behind us. When we finally broke out of the woods near Grandpa's backyard, I nearly collapsed. Ryan was gasping for air, doubled over next to me. The porch light flicked on, and Kate was there. Her face was pale and drawn, and she looked like she'd been crying. "Where the hell were you?" she said. "I waited forever." Grandpa stepped out behind her holding a flashlight and wearing his old canvas coat. His eyes scanned us quickly. "What happened?" We didn't answer right away. I was still catching my breath. Ryan looked like he might puke. Grandpa led us inside and closed the door behind us. The warmth of the house felt strange after the chill of the woods. We sat around the kitchen table while he turned on the big battery-powered radio he kept in the pantry. He flipped through local channels, checking for any events that might explain what we'd heard. There was nothing. Just bluegrass music, weather, and silence. No announcements, no local festivals. Grandpa turned the volume down. "I told you those ridges have stories," he said. "Some of them are true." He went on to explain more. That there were families in the Appalachian backwoods who hadn't come down to town in decades. People who lived off deer and rainwater, built their homes by hand, and passed down old traditions brought from Scotland and Ireland generations ago. They didn't take kindly to outsiders. Most of them weren't violent, just private. But sometimes people got too close, and things didn't always end well. Kate had barely spoken since we sat down. She just stared at the table. Ryan rubbed his arms like he was still cold. "What were they doing out there?" I asked. Grandpa shook his head. "Could be anything. Memorial, harvest, burial, birth. They do things different, but they hold to it strong." None of us slept much that night. The woods outside the window felt too quiet again. I kept thinking I'd hear that drumming start up again. But the only sound was the wind brushing the side of the house and the occasional creak of the porch boards cooling in the night. In the morning, Grandpa woke Ryan and me early. He was already dressed and had a small field bag over his shoulder. "Let's go," he said. "We're gonna look." We hiked back up the slope, retracing our path from the night before. This time we moved slower, checking the ground for anything we missed. The morning sun was bright, but the woods still held a damp chill. When we got to the spot where we'd crouched behind the laurel bush, Grandpa kept walking, motioning for us to follow. About 20 yards further, we stepped into a small clearing. The grass had been pressed down by many feet. In the center was a circle of stones, blackened from fire. Bits of wood, half burned, still sat in the pit. Around it were footprints, more than I could count. Some barefoot, some in old-style boots, and on one low branch, a scrap of cloth was caught. Tartan, blue and green with a red stripe. Grandpa took it down and held it in his hand. "Scottish," he said. "Clan MacLeod, maybe." He was crouched near the fire pit when the sound started again, faint but unmistakable. The drums, and then the same high, haunting notes. Through the trees at the far end of the clearing, movement. A group of figures was moving slowly, each carrying something. One had a wooden frame that looked like a dulcimer. Another held a staff. Their clothing looked handmade, old, but not ragged. Thick wool, layers, some with wide leather belts. One of them was chanting. The others followed. They hadn't seen us yet. We all dropped low behind a fallen log. Grandpa's face was unreadable. Ryan looked like he was about to bolt. "Stay still," Grandpa whispered. "Don't talk. Don't move." We watched as the figures circled around the fire pit and began to arrange objects on the stones. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, like they'd done it many times before. One man poured something into the pit. Another stepped forward and placed a wooden mask on a stick, planting it upright in the ground. No one laughed. No one spoke above a murmur. Grandpa leaned in close to me. "These folks are settler descendants, still practicing old rites. Could be harvest time. Could be something else." Then he looked back toward the trail. "This is enough. We go now." We backed out the way we came, moving quietly and slowly, taking care not to step on branches. No one looked back. Once we were far enough away, we picked up the pace and didn't stop until we were back near the ridgeline and heading down toward the house. The forest felt different again. Still, but not heavy. Just quiet. That afternoon, Grandpa sat down at the kitchen table and called the sheriff. He explained what we saw and gave the exact location of the clearing. Ryan and I sat in the living room listening, pretending we weren't. Kate still hadn't said much. The sheriff's deputy came by 3 days later. He wore plain clothes and drove an unmarked SUV. He asked Grandpa a lot of questions, took notes, asked us what we'd seen. When we told him about the clothing and the music, he just nodded. "You'd be surprised how many folks live out here and don't want anything to do with the rest of us," he said. "Some of them got no birth certificates, no taxes, no records, just passed down land in quiet ways." He told us they usually don't interfere unless there's a danger to someone, kids, sick people, that sort of thing. But he appreciated the information. "They stay out of sight for a reason," he said, "but it helps to know where they are." He left just before sunset. Grandpa watched the tail lights disappear down the dirt road, then went back inside without saying anything. I still think about those people. Sometimes late at night I remember the sounds, the way they drifted through the trees like they didn't belong to this time. It wasn't spooky, not exactly, just other, like something ancient still pulsing under the hills. Grandpa never spoke about it again, and neither did Kate. Ryan brought it up once the following year, but only in passing. We never went back up that ridge. I don't think I ever will. Some things in those woods are better left alone. I've been living in my isolated house in the Appalachian Mountains for 20 years now. Long enough that I know the area like the back of my hand. I built the house myself with some help from an old friend who's since passed. It's not fancy. Wood stove, well water, radio for weather updates. But it's all I need. I hunt. I grow a few vegetables, and I keep mostly to myself. The closest neighbor is 3 miles down the road, and he only drives up when his propane runs out. This is a quiet place. That's why I stayed. That night started like any other. The sun was dipping behind the ridge, painting the trees orange and gold. I had just finished chopping kindling for the next cold snap, and Max, my Labrador, was watching squirrels from the porch. He's usually mellow in the evenings, dozing while I finish up outside, but something had him on edge. I noticed it when I stepped inside to clean up. He stayed by the window, stiff-legged and growling. Not barking, just this low sound in his throat that I hadn't heard since a bear wandered through 2 summers ago. I tried calling him to the kitchen for dinner, but he ignored me, kept his eyes on the trees beyond the yard. It was already getting dark, and I remembered I hadn't locked the shed. It sits about 200 yards downhill, just past the edge of the clearing, and holds most of my tools and backup supplies. I always lock it before sunset. I was sure I had. I even remember twisting the key that afternoon. Still, I grabbed the flashlight and headed down. Max followed immediately, sticking close like he does during storms. I didn't like how jittery he was. His ears kept twitching, and he'd stop every few steps to look back toward the house. The path to the shed was lined with pine needles and the last of the fall leaves. I could see my breath. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. No crickets, no owls. When I reached the shed, the door was cracked open an inch. The padlock hung from the latch, unfastened. I stood there a moment, staring at it. I hadn't left it like that. I never do. I swung the flashlight beam inside. Everything looked untouched. Rakes, gas cans, chainsaw. Still, I didn't like it. I clicked the lock shut, gave it a tug to be sure. That's when I heard it. Branches snapping, leaves rustling heavily somewhere behind me, deeper in the trees. Not just one branch. It was a series of breaks, loud and rough, like something big moving fast through thick brush. I turned and shone the flashlight toward the sound. The beam only hit trees and shadows. Max pressed against my legs, whining now. I didn't call out. Didn't move at first. I listened, trying to figure out if it was a bear or maybe a group of deer spooked by something. But it wasn't right. Too much movement. Too wide a spread, like more than one large thing moving at once. Then another crack, this one closer. I turned back up the path. Max was already ahead of me, tail tucked. I walked fast but steady. Didn't run. I've learned not to panic out here. Whatever it was, I didn't want to provoke it. By the time I reached the clearing, my flashlight flicked once and went dark. Battery was fine. I'd checked it the day before. But I didn't stop to mess with it. I got up to the porch and went straight inside, bolting the door behind me. My hunting rifle hangs by the back door, loaded as always. I took it down and stepped back onto the porch, flashlight still dead in my pocket. The night had fully set in. No moon, just the black silhouette of trees against darker sky. That's when I heard it. Voices. Not loud. Not yelling. Just low, muffled speech, like a conversation happening a few 100 feet away. Too far to understand the words, but close enough to know it was human. My property line is marked, fenced in places, posted with signs every 50 yards. Nobody just wanders onto it. The voices moved. At first to the east, toward the old deer stand I built years ago. Then south, by the slope that leads to the creek. Each time the voices faded, then came back from a different direction. Like they were circling. I stood with the rifle across my chest, Max at my feet, his ears pinned and body trembling. This wasn't kids, not hikers. They wouldn't be moving like that in the dark, Not this deep into private land. I stayed on the porch, every light inside off. My finger rested outside the trigger guard. I don't fire unless I have to, but I've never had to raise the rifle over human voices before. The sound stopped for a minute. I listened hard, trying to catch any noise. Wind, maybe, or the creek again. Nothing. Then a sharp, metallic clank came from the side of the house, like a shovel hitting the propane tank cage. Max growled again, louder this time. I moved to the edge of the porch, aiming low. Didn't see anything, just the glint of the metal cage catching starlight. Another sound, this one behind me, near the back door. I stepped backwards slowly, turning to cover both sides. My mouth was dry. Max wouldn't stop whimpering now. Something was out there, and they knew how to move quiet, knew how to spread out, knew not to show a light. I started thinking about poachers, or meth runners. We've had both in this region over the years, though never on my land. They were testing the perimeter, seeing if the house was empty maybe, or if someone inside would react. I kept the rifle steady and waited, eyes straining against the dark. Nothing moved. No more voices. No more clanks. Then, from behind the shed down the hill, a second set of cracking branches. Slower now. Deliberate. Max pressed hard against my leg. I chambered around. All night long I heard the voices moving. Not constantly, but shifting in and out like they were taking turns. I'd hear them from one side of the house, then nothing. Then again from a different spot, too far apart for one person to be moving that fast. It would go quiet the second I stood up or moved toward a window. I tested it. Stood still in the dark with the rifle resting in my lap, and after a few minutes, I'd hear the murmur again. Barely audible, but definitely human. Max didn't sleep. He didn't even lie down. He sat pressed against my legs the entire time, his head low and ears back, eyes flicking to whichever window was nearest. At one point, I thought I saw something just past the tree line. A figure maybe, but it vanished when I blinked. I stopped turning on lights. They didn't use flashlights. They didn't want to be seen. But they sure wanted to see me. It became obvious after a few hours. They knew when I was watching. They changed position based on my movements. This wasn't random noise. It was surveillance. Deliberate, coordinated watching. I started checking the locks every half hour. The cabin has 3 doors, all reinforced. The windows are double-paned, small, set high. Still, I sat with the rifle across my chest, feeling like those thin walls were made of paper. By the time the horizon started to turn gray, the voices began to move away. Not all at once, but in stages, like one would signal the others. I heard twigs snapping and what sounded like boots crunching pine needles. It was quieter than the night before, more distant. I waited another full hour before I moved. Didn't open a curtain. Didn't switch on a light. Just sat there, heart still racing, until I couldn't hear a thing. When the sun was fully up, I stepped outside with the rifle and Max right behind me. The morning was colder than usual, the air still. The ground was damp from the dew, and it didn't take long to see where they'd been. There were flattened patches of grass all around the clearing, especially near the tree line. Some right near the shed, some near the porch. At least 3 spots where someone had stood or crouched for a long time. The soil there was soft enough to show clear boot prints. Heavy treads, maybe hiking or work boots. I walked the perimeter slowly, rifle at the ready, looking for anything else they might have left behind. One of the prints was right at the edge of the porch light's range. That was the worst part, knowing someone had been standing just beyond the glow, watching me from 10 feet away. I found broken twigs, snapped at odd angles like someone had stepped off the path too quickly. They'd moved through with some care, but not enough to leave no trace. The tracks led into the woods. I followed them for about 50 yards until the soft ground turned rocky. From there, nothing. No more prints, no scraps of fabric, no dropped gear, just empty forest. They knew the terrain better than I expected. They'd chosen a route that erased their presence. Back at the house, I double-checked all the locks again before heading into town. The drive was long, nearly an hour down the winding gravel road. When I got to the hardware store, I bought 4 security cameras, motion-activated with night vision. Not cheap, but I didn't care. I also picked up fresh batteries, spare SD cards, and extra locks for the shed. That same afternoon, I installed the cameras. One on the porch facing the path, one behind the house near the propane cage, one aimed at the shed, and another pointed out toward the tree line on the southern edge. Max stayed close the whole time, pacing, ears twitching at every small sound in the woods. When I called the sheriff's office, I expected them to write it off. But the deputy who came out actually listened. He was young, maybe 30, polite. He didn't act surprised when I described the voices and tracks. He said there had been a few reports from other folks in the mountains lately. Isolated places, similar setups, sometimes miles apart. People seeing figures at night, hearing voices. Things moved around that shouldn't have been. He told me. Could be illegal operations, meth labs, grow sites, or maybe they're just scoping places out for burglary. Hard to say. He took a few photos, filed a report, and said they'd do more patrols up my way when they could. But with the department stretched thin, I didn't expect much. That night, I slept with the rifle beside the bed. I didn't hear anything. No voices, no movement. Same with the next night, and the one after that. Weeks passed. I checked the camera footage every morning. Raccoons, a bobcat once, plenty of deer. One clip showed a bear nosing around near the shed, but that was it. No people, no shadows, no boots crunching through the clearing. Still, I never let my guard down. Months later, I got a new batch of SD cards and reviewed the footage from the last few weeks. Nothing. Just wind in the trees, squirrels, Max chasing something through the yard. The peace helped. But I still kept the rifle loaded, still locked the doors early, still walked the property every morning with Max beside me. Living up here, you think you're alone. Most days, that's true. But you never really know what's watching from the trees. Max doesn't leave my side after dark anymore, and I don't blame him. David and I left Pittsburgh early on a Friday morning, wanting as much daylight as possible before heading deep into the West Virginia mountains. The drive took hours, and once we left the highways behind, the roads turned narrow and winding, cutting through thick forest. We parked where the dirt track ended and started the long hike in. Both of us preferred isolated places over crowded campgrounds. No bathrooms, no rangers, no signs, just raw woods. By the 6th hour of walking, sweat had dried into salt on our shirts, and the straps of our packs dug into our shoulders. That was when we came across the ruins. The cabin was half burned, half rotten. A section of the roof had caved in years ago, leaving a skeleton of blackened beams. One wall was collapsed inward, boards sagging into a pile of ash and leaves. Moss spread across what was left of the porch, and broken glass sparkled faintly in the dirt. Neither of us said much about it, but I remember noticing the smell still faintly there. Charred wood that rain and time hadn't completely erased. We stood looking at it for a few minutes, then moved on. About a quarter-mile past it, we found a clearing near a cold stream that cut through the rocks. It felt cut off from everything. No road sounds, no planes overhead. Just the rush of water and the quiet groan of trees in the wind. We set up camp. David got the fire going while I laid out the tent on the flattest part of ground. The sun dropped quick behind the ridge, and the forest went from gold to shadow. We boiled rice and cooked a couple packets of chicken over the fire, the smell rising with the smoke. We ate with our backs against a fallen log, listening to the stream. After dinner, David started talking about his office and how management was making his life impossible. I mostly just nodded, watching the fire burn lower. Around midnight, the flames were almost gone, leaving just a glow in the coals. We sat close to it, both wrapped in our jackets. The night air pressed in hard, colder than we'd expected. David broke off mid-sentence, staring past me. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I turned, but all I saw was the dark wall of trees beyond the stream. Branches swayed a little, and I thought maybe he meant the wind. Then I saw it too. Something shifting in the blackness, not in rhythm with the trees. A shadow sliding between trunks, low and steady. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a deer. But then another shape appeared, and then another, moving differently than animals. David's face tightened. We both sat frozen, eyes locked on the tree line. The fire gave off just enough light to make the clearing visible, but the woods beyond were thick with dark. That's when the figures started stepping out from it. At least 5 of them. Maybe more, I couldn't tell at first. They wore camo jackets and pants, boots heavy on the soil. Rifles hung in their hands, some with flashlights clipped near the barrels. The beams cut across our clearing, sweeping over our tent, our packs, then our faces. Not one of them said a word. "Hey!" I called out, my voice rough in my throat. "What's going on?" No answer. They just spread around us, slipping into positions like they'd done it before. One stood by the stream, one behind our tent, 2 to the left, 1 to the right. The flashlights blinded me every time they landed on my eyes. The sound of water and the hiss of firewood filled the silence. David asked louder, "Is there a problem?" His voice cracked slightly at the end. Still nothing. The nearest man raised his hand, a slow motion across his throat like telling us to shut up. His expression was hard and unreadable under the shadow of his cap. I felt my stomach sink. These weren't hikers or hunters passing through. They weren't joking, and they weren't curious. Their silence was heavier than shouting. My palms were damp against my knees, but I forced myself to stay still. The men settled in like they were setting a perimeter. Each of them angled just enough so we couldn't make a break without crossing a rifle barrel. The one nearest to me shifted his boot, scraping dirt, the muzzle of his gun hanging loose but deliberate. I realized then that if we moved too fast, things would go bad immediately. I tried again. "We didn't know this was anyone's land. We'll leave first thing in the morning." My words felt thin against their silence. The man closest just shook his head once, slow, his jaw clenched. He pointed 2 fingers to the ground like ordering us to stay put. David turned to me for half a second, his face pale in the glow. He didn't have to say anything. We both knew we were trapped. The rifles gleamed in the flashlight's glare. None of the men spoke. They stood still but tense, as though waiting on a signal we couldn't see. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I tried to figure out what they wanted, but the longer it went on, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple warning. They were waiting for something, or someone, and we had no idea what. We moved slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves that might set them off. The man closest to us gestured with his rifle, motioning for us to gather our gear. My hands shook as I stuffed what I could into my backpack, every zipper sounding too loud in the dead silence. David did the same, eyes fixed on the ground. They didn't stop us from taking the basics, our packs, water bottles, sleeping bags, but everything else we left behind. It was obvious we weren't allowed to argue. When we stood up, one of them flicked his flashlight toward the trees, signaling that it was time to go. We backed away slowly, neither of us daring to turn our backs. The men moved with us, spreading out in a wide arc until we reached the edge of the clearing. They stopped there, holding their ground, rifles still raised. I kept expecting a gunshot to crack the night as some kind of final warning, but it never came. Once the shadows swallowed us, David whispered, "Keep moving." We pushed through brush and branches, stumbling blindly deeper into the forest. We didn't use our flashlights. The risk of giving away our position was too high. Every twig that snapped under our boots sounded like a gunshot. We found a patch of thick undergrowth and forced ourselves inside, lying flat and still. The night dragged on endlessly. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of wood made my chest lock tight. Once or twice, I swore I heard faint voices. Whether it was them or just the forest, I couldn't tell. We stayed that way until the black sky lightened to gray. Neither of us had slept. Our bodies ached from lying on roots, but we didn't dare move until the sun cleared the ridge. When morning came, the first thing we noticed was the smoke. It rose straight into the sky from the direction of our campsite, a gray column against the pale blue. No mistake. It was where we'd been. I knew instantly what it meant. They had burned whatever we'd left behind. It wasn't about cleaning up a campsite. It was about sending a message. We circled wide, keeping as far from the clearing as possible. Without our map or compass, the trail was harder to find. We had to guess our direction by the slope of the mountain and the sound of water running downhill. Hours passed. Our clothes were torn from forcing through brush. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but stopping felt too dangerous. Every so often we looked over our shoulders, half convinced we'd see camo figures slipping through the trees after us. By the time we finally stumbled onto the trail, our legs were rubber. The last miles to the parking lot felt endless. But when the dirt opened up to asphalt and our car sat waiting, I could almost collapse from relief. We didn't speak as we threw our packs inside and shut the doors. Only when the engine turned over did I feel like we might actually be safe. At the trailhead, a ranger was leaning against his truck. He eyed our wrecked appearance and came over. "Rough night?" he asked. We didn't tell him everything at first, just that we'd run into some locals who made it clear we weren't welcome. His expression hardened. He nodded slowly, as if it wasn't the first time he'd heard the story. He explained that in these mountains, there are families who live far off the grid. Some were just reclusive. Others, he said bluntly, made money from things they couldn't have outsiders stumbling into, illegal hunting, crops, or worse. They see strangers out there, they'll do whatever it takes to make sure you don't come back, he said. His tone carried the weight of truth. Next time, stick to the marked trails, and if you want to report it, you can. But I'll be honest with you, law enforcement won't do much out there. David and I stood there, absorbing his words. The message was clear. We'd been lucky. When we got into the car, neither of us felt like talking. The drive back to Pittsburgh was silent, broken only by the sound of tires on pavement. I kept seeing the rifles and the flashlight beams, the men's faces unreadable in the dark. By the time the skyline of the city came into view, I knew we'd both been changed. We'd gone looking for solitude and adventure, and we'd found something else entirely. Now, whenever we plan a trip, we check everything. Local reports, access rules, even old stories about the area. Because the danger isn't always bears, storms, or cliffs. Sometimes it's people. People who don't want you there. People who will make sure you never come back. That night in the Appalachians taught me something I can't forget. The wilderness has rules, but not all of them come from nature. I had planned a 5-day solo hike through a remote section of the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't my first time doing something like that. I'd done shorter trips solo before, and I always kept to marked trails and logged my routes with a buddy back home. But this one was different. I wanted solitude, real isolation. So I picked a route that kept me away from popular campsites and busy loops. The area I chose was mostly untouched, with only the occasional ranger marker every few miles. I started early on a Monday morning in August, the heat still bearable if you moved slow and stayed hydrated. I had about 40 pounds of gear on my back and enough food for a week. The first day went exactly how I wanted. Nothing but trees, wind, and birds. I saw 2 deer and 0 people. I liked that. By noon the second day, I was moving up a steep incline toward a high ridge I'd planned to camp on that night. The air got thinner, and the sounds of the forest started thinning too. I paused halfway up a long, rocky slope to catch my breath, and that's when I saw him. A man, maybe in his mid-50s, stood about 20 feet off the trail near a crooked tree. He wore a torn canvas jacket, dark pants, and boots that looked like they were falling apart. What was strange was what he didn't have. No backpack, no water bottle, no sign he was hiking. Just a faded shoulder bag hanging low across his chest. He waved like he'd been waiting for someone. I waved back, keeping a steady tone when I spoke. "You okay out here?" I asked. He smiled, then walked toward me, keeping a short distance. "Trail ahead clear?" he said, voice thin but not shaky. "Been walking since early morning." I nodded. "Trail's clear. Gets steep about 30 minutes from here, but it flattens out near the ridge." He looked toward the top of the hill, then back at me. "You heading that way?" "Yeah," I said. He nodded again and adjusted the strap of his bag. "Just day hiking," he said. "Didn't expect it to be so far out." That didn't sit right with me. We were more than 10 miles from the nearest road. Nobody day hiked out this far without gear. And he wasn't sweating. No dirt on him. His boots looked beat up, but his clothes were strangely clean. I just nodded politely, not wanting to turn the moment into anything. "Appreciate the info," he said, then turned and stepped back off the trail into the trees. He didn't say goodbye, didn't ask anything else. Just disappeared between the brush. I stood there for a minute, watching the spot where he vanished. I listened, but there was no sound, no crunching leaves, no branches moving, no footsteps, nothing. I kept moving up the slope, glancing behind me a few times. When I got to the ridge an hour later, my legs burned, and I was ready to rest. The wind was stronger up there, blowing steadily from the west, and I found a good flat patch under a low pine where I could pitch my tent. I set up camp slowly, took my time securing everything. I didn't see anyone on the way up. No signs of recent hikers. By dusk, I had a fire going, my dinner heating on the small metal stove. Then, just as the sky turned orange, I saw him again. He was sitting on a rock maybe 30 yards away. Just sitting there, like he'd been there all along. Same clothes, same bag. His hands rested in his lap. He was facing the sunset, not looking at me. I watched him for a few seconds. He didn't move, just stared out toward the horizon. I didn't say anything. Didn't want to. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to notice him. But I couldn't ignore it. I stood up and walked a few steps toward him, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey," I called out. "You end up hiking the same route?" He turned his head slowly, like he hadn't expected me to speak, Got turned around, he said. Been trying to find the way back down. That way, I said, pointing back toward the slope I climbed earlier. Trail's marked. You probably passed a few signs. He didn't look, just kept staring at me now. You camping here tonight? Yeah, I said. He nodded, then stood up, brushing off his jacket. You think I could stay nearby? Just for the night. I paused. You don't have gear. You're not set up for cold. Temp's gonna drop a lot once the sun's down. I'll be fine, he said. Just need a spot to rest. Been walking all day. I didn't answer. My gut told me something was off. He started asking more questions. Casual ones at first, then too specific. You planning to stay on the ridge tomorrow? What time you usually start hiking in the morning? How far do you think it is to the nearest ranger station? They didn't line up with his story. If he was lost, why was he asking about my plans instead of finding his way down? Why hadn't he mentioned being out of water? I said I needed to get firewood and stepped into the trees. I didn't go far, just out of sight behind a thick patch of pine, and knelt down, watching my tent from 100 feet out. He didn't move at first, just stood there, facing the tent. Then slowly he walked around it once, stopping to look at the zippered entrance. He stood still for a long time. Then, without saying anything, he walked back to the rock and sat down again. I waited. The sun dipped below the trees. Darkness started closing in. I didn't light my headlamp. Just stayed crouched there, watching. And that's where I stayed. In the forest, hidden in the brush, not making a sound. From my hiding spot in the trees, I watched him unzip my backpack and start pulling things out. He worked fast, checking each item like he was looking for something specific. It wasn't random. He wasn't just rifling through for food or supplies. He opened every pocket, checked the labels on bottles, unrolled my sleeping pad, flipped through my trail map. Then he held up my small notebook, flipping through it like he expected to find something inside. His head turned suddenly, eyes scanning the dark tree line. He stood up slowly and shouted my name. He said it like he'd known it for years. I froze behind the log, trying not to breathe loud. I'd never told him my name. Not when we first spoke, not at the campsite. I hadn't said a single personal detail. But he called out for me again, louder this time, like he was sure I was still close. Come on, he yelled, voice stretched between casual and forceful. I know you're out here. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the area, then walked a few feet from the fire pit and stood listening. You left your stuff behind. Not smart. I stayed completely still. My legs were cramping from the crouch, but I didn't move. He kept talking, asking me to come out, saying things like, "We can work this out," and "You don't need to hide." His voice shifted again, almost annoyed now. He kicked over the cooking pot I'd left by the fire and walked toward the bushes at the edge of the campsite. I thought he might actually start searching the forest, but instead, he stopped and stared out into the trees. "I've seen you," he said. "Watched you since Sunday." Then he crouched and picked something up, my camp knife. He examined it for a few seconds, then slid it into his jacket pocket. My chest tightened. I was unarmed. That was the only blade I'd packed. He wandered around for another 20 minutes, calling out occasionally, circling the tent twice, pausing by the tree where I'd hung my food bag. Then, finally, he walked to the edge of the ridge and looked out toward the valley. He stood there a long time, not saying anything, just staring into the dark. When he turned and walked away, he didn't follow the trail down. He moved off the slope, disappearing into the trees on the opposite side. I waited there until his footsteps faded. Then I waited longer. Nearly 2 hours passed before I dared to shift position. My legs were completely numb. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat behind the log, listening to the woods breathe around me, waiting for him to come back. He never did. When the sky turned gray and the outlines of trees started to appear, I moved. I circled wide around the campsite, never getting closer than 50 feet. From the edge of a thicket, I saw the tent still standing, the fire cold, my gear scattered. I didn't see him. I didn't risk going all the way in. Just close enough to grab my water filter, compass, and the food I'd hung from the tree. I left the tent, sleeping bag, stove, everything else. I didn't care about the weight. I just wanted to get off that ridge. I moved fast, keeping to the trail but checking behind me constantly. Every broken branch or squirrel darting through brush made my stomach drop. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to drink. I reached the lower trail junction by mid-morning and followed the signs toward the ranger station marked 10 miles away. The trail was narrow and slick from morning dew, but I didn't slow down. It took me almost 3 hours to reach the ranger building. By then, my knees were shot and my shirt was soaked. The ranger behind the desk took one look at me and didn't ask for small talk. I told him everything, short and fast, still glancing over my shoulder like the man might show up behind me. They brought me water and a blanket and asked me to go over the details again. What he looked like, what he said, where it happened, how long he'd been watching me. I gave them everything I could remember. The ranger's face didn't change much, but I noticed the other guy in the office had stopped pretending to do paperwork and was just listening. When I finished, the ranger looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're not the first one." He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, thick, disorganized, full of handwritten notes and printed emails. "We've had several reports of a man like that. Always solo hikers, always deep trail sections." He didn't say it directly, but I could tell. Nobody had caught the guy. Not yet. They took my contact info and told me to stick around while they radioed other outposts and passed on the description. Another ranger gave me a protein bar and told me not to head back out. They arranged for a shuttle to take me to the nearest trail town. I didn't argue. I stayed in a cheap motel that night, called my friend back home, told him I was cutting the trip short. I didn't go into details. Just said there was a situation on the trail and I needed a few days to recover. A week later, I got a call from the same ranger. He said they'd found him. They didn't go into detail, but the man had been staying in a handmade shelter deep in a restricted zone, far from any official trail. Inside, they found gear, food wrappers, clothing, none of it his. My notebook was there, my tent, items from other hikers. He hadn't just been scavenging, he'd been collecting. The ranger told me he'd been watching hikers for weeks at a time, picking his targets carefully, following them for days, learning their habits. He never stayed in one place long, never made camp near trail markers. He always stayed just out of sight, always waiting for the right moment. They arrested him without a struggle. He didn't say much, just kept asking why they were bothering. Said he hadn't done anything. They found no weapons besides a few knives. Nothing that connected him directly to a violent act. Just stolen items and trail journals he'd scribbled over, entries from hikers with their names scratched out and replaced. They said they couldn't charge him with anything serious, not unless someone came forward with more evidence. But they had enough to ban him from the national parks, enough to keep him in custody for a while. They offered to return my gear. I told them they could keep it. I haven't gone on a solo trip since. Maybe I will again one day. Maybe not. But I know now that even far out in the wilderness, where you think the only threat is weather or wildlife, people are still the most unpredictable thing out there. So when I was 20, me and my college roommates Rachel and Katie decided to spend a weekend at Pine Grove Campground in the Appalachian foothills. Rachel had found it online a few weeks earlier, said it was remote but not completely cut off. We just wanted something quiet after midterms. The drive from campus was about 3 hours. We stopped at a small gas station along the way, grabbed snacks, filled the tank. Nothing weird at that point. The campground was broken up into sections. Families and RVs in one part, tent campers in another, and then the back section near the woods where we set up. It was quieter there, more spaced out. We picked a site that had this wide gravel pad with a fire ring and some logs set up around it. There was a trailhead maybe 50 feet from our site, leading deeper into the woods. No one else was nearby except a group of guys who had set up about 2 sites down. We saw them when we were unloading the car, maybe early 20s, loud, all wearing these matching camo jackets. One of them whistled when Rachel bent over to pull the cooler out of the back seat. Another said something like, "Hope y'all ain't scared of the dark." Katie rolled her eyes and we ignored it. We set up the tent, a big 8-person one with a front vestibule and separate sleeping area. It took us about an hour, but we got it done. Then we made dinner. Instant noodles, canned chili, chips. Normal stuff. The guys walked past our site once, heading toward the trailhead. Said nothing, just looked. One of them held eye contact with me too long. I remember his boots. Mud caked up high like he'd been out there a while. They didn't have backpacks or anything. After it got dark, we stayed in the tent with the lantern on. Rachel had downloaded a bunch of scary Reddit stories, and we were reading them out loud, trying to spook each other. Around 10 yo, Katie was halfway through one about someone being stalked in a parking garage when we heard it. A soft meowing, like a cat. It was right outside the tent, right up against the nylon wall near where we kept our shoes. At first, it was kind of funny. I said maybe someone lost their pet. Then Rachel pointed out that there was no one near us with a cat. Katie unzipped the window flap and shined a flashlight through the mesh. Nothing. But the meowing kept going. After maybe 5 minutes, it stopped. Then, about 10 minutes later, we heard crying. Not adult crying. It sounded like a toddler. From somewhere in the woods. Faint, but very clear. The sound came from behind the tent, toward the trailhead. The crying was steady. Same tone, same pattern, like it was on a loop. It didn't sound natural. We all went completely silent. Katie whispered, "That's not real." We just sat there listening. Rachel killed the lantern. We sat in the dark. Katie leaned closer to the tent wall, listening. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. The meowing was too high up, like it was coming from someone's mouth. Rachel added, "It was too clean. Not how a real cat sounds, more like someone imitating it." I hadn't thought about that part before, but they were right. It wasn't messy or broken. Same with the crying. Like it had no emotion in it. Just a repeated loop. We didn't leave the tent. We didn't even unzip the door. We just sat there, listening. After maybe 15 more minutes, the sounds started moving. First from the woods behind the tent, then slowly around us in a circle. The crying and the meowing, switching off. Sometimes both at the same time. Always close, never more than 30 feet away. We stayed dead still. Katie said, "They're trying to scare us out." I nodded, even though no one could see it. We all understood. None of us wanted to say what we were thinking, but it was obvious. Someone was using a speaker or making the noises themselves, trying to get us to come outside. The sounds weren't random. They were circling us. We heard branches break, not far, not like an animal would. They were snapping like someone stepping on them, slow and intentional. No lights, no voices, just those fake sounds. I checked the time on my phone. It was 11:17. I texted my dad that everything was fine, just in case. I don't know why I did that, but I wanted some proof that we'd been there. Rachel whispered, "No one's laughing. If this was a prank, there'd be laughing." She was right again. There wasn't even rustling, just footsteps, just sound. At some point we stopped whispering. It was like if we didn't talk, they'd go away. Katie had this tiny pocket knife in her bag. She passed it over to me. Rachel held a metal flashlight like a bat. We stayed pressed against the floor of the tent, frozen. Around midnight, the sounds just stopped. No more crying, no meowing, nothing. Not even footsteps. Just silence. Rachel turned the lantern back on. We sat in that light, staring at the tent walls, listening for anything. But the woods were completely quiet. We waited maybe 30 minutes before anyone moved. Then Katie said, "Let's just wait for daylight." No one argued. I barely remember falling asleep. I think I just passed out from the stress. At 2 in the morning, I woke up to what I thought was someone unzipping the outer vestibule of the tent. At first, I thought maybe it was Rachel or Katie going out to pee. But when I looked around in the dim light, they were both still lying there. Then something heavy crashed into the camping chairs we'd left outside. Rachel sat up fast and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I was already grabbing the knife we'd used earlier to slice apples. It was the only thing within reach. More banging sounds came from the vestibule. Metal clanking, plastic scraping on gravel. Someone was in there, just thrashing around. Not talking, just bumping into stuff, like they were going through everything or maybe stumbling. The zipper between the vestibule and our sleeping section was still shut. We backed into the far end of the tent. I held the knife pointed toward the zipper. Rachel was trying to unlock her phone. Katie didn't say anything, just sat frozen with the flashlight in her hand but didn't turn it on. Rachel whispered, "I'm calling 911. Her hands were shaking. The signal was weak, but it went through. She kept her voice low and said we were at Pine Grove Campground, Site 48. Someone was outside the tent and we were scared. The 911 operator stayed on the line. I heard Rachel say, "No, they haven't said anything. They're just making noise." Then it stopped. Just silence. No zipper, no footsteps, nothing. Like whoever it was froze in place. None of us moved. We waited maybe a minute before we heard footsteps again. Slower this time, crunching leaves as the person walked away. Then about 20 feet off, we heard someone vomiting hard in the bushes. Gagging, coughing, then more puking. It sounded like they were drunk, or maybe on something worse. We didn't move. We just sat there and listened until it got quiet again. It felt like hours before the sky started to lighten. When the sun was finally up, we stepped out one at a time. Our gear in the vestibule was all over the place. The cooler had been tipped, chairs knocked over, food scattered. But nothing was missing. No valuables taken. The zipper wasn't broken. It had been opened and then closed again. We packed up as fast as we could. No one wanted to talk much. It felt like we were being watched. Rachel kept glancing over her shoulder, and Katie didn't say a single word until we reached the car. When we rolled down the gravel road toward the exit, we passed by the group of guys from the day before. They were sitting at their picnic table, shirtless, drinking something out of solo cups. One of them looked right at us and grinned. Another leaned in and whispered something to his friend. Then they both laughed and looked directly at our car. Katie muttered, "It was them." Rachel didn't say anything. I just kept driving. We didn't stop for gas or food. We just drove straight back to campus. That was the quietest ride we ever had. I waited a couple of days before calling the campground office. I figured maybe they'd want to know what happened, A woman answered. I told her about the meowing, the fake crying, and someone coming into our tent vestibule. She didn't sound surprised at all. She said, "Yeah, we've had other complaints like that." I asked if it was common, and she said, "Unfortunately, yes. Some groups come up there regularly and think it's funny to scare people." She said they especially like targeting women campers. I asked why they don't ban them or report them, and she said it's hard to prove anything. The guys deny it. There's no cameras. Rangers don't patrol at night unless someone's hurt. She said sometimes they'll imitate animal sounds, babies crying, or just circle a tent to make people afraid. It's just something we deal with, she said. I'm really sorry it happened to you. That's when I realized none of it was random. It wasn't just a bad night or a drunk guy wandering off the trail. It was planned. A group of guys spent the night trying to scare us for their own fun, and no one could do anything about it. No one even tried. What felt terrifying at the time, like something out of a horror movie, was just someone else's joke. That shook me worse than anything. Now, whenever someone mentions camping, I always ask where. I search for reviews, complaints, anything that might hint at poor security or regular trouble. I don't take chances. Not anymore. You think you're in the woods, away from everything. But the worst part isn't nature. It's people who don't care what they do to others as long as they get a laugh out of it. It happened last spring when me, Sarah, and Jake decided to hike in New River Gorge National Park in West Virginia. We'd all heard about some abandoned 19th century cemetery somewhere off the marked trails, and a local guy at a gas station had told us it still existed if you knew where to look. The idea of finding something old and hidden like that sounded way more interesting than just another overlook hike, so we decided to try and find it. We drove down early Saturday morning, parked near the main trailhead around 11:45 a.m. I remember the parking lot looked kind of full, at least 6 or 7 cars, but the whole area was dead silent. No voices, no footsteps, no one at the map board or loading gear from trunks. We thought maybe everyone had already set off into the forest, but we didn't see or hear anyone the entire time we were there. Just quiet. Not even birds. It was strange, but none of us said anything about it. It was just one of those things you kind of notice, but don't want to make a big deal out of. By noon, we were on the trail. The sun was out, no clouds, decent temperature. We followed the official trail for a while, then split off toward an old path we'd found on an archived map online. The terrain got steeper and rockier, overgrown in some spots. It clearly wasn't maintained anymore. At one point, Sarah almost twisted her ankle on a loose root, and Jake had to help her balance across a small washout that had cut through the trail. After about an hour and a half, we stopped for lunch. It was quiet the whole time. Like weirdly quiet. I kept checking around for other hikers, or even just animals rustling in the brush, but it was like the woods were empty. The air felt heavy. Not hot, but like pressure. Like the quiet was pressing in on your ears. I didn't want to say anything and make Sarah nervous though, since she gets spooked easy. Jake didn't seem to notice or didn't care. We kept hiking up through rougher and denser forest. No real trail now. We were using GPS and a printout of a historical site overlay to guess where the cemetery should be. It took hours, but eventually, around 4 o'clock, we came over a ridge, and there it was. Stone headstones, crooked and leaning, some buried halfway in the moss. The trees were thicker here, and it was darker even though the sun was still out. It didn't feel peaceful. The whole area felt forgotten, like something people weren't supposed to find. We spread out, stepping over vines and under low branches. The graves were from the 1800s, lots of the names worn down or chipped away. One still had a legible carving that said 1852. Some of the stones had those old-fashioned lamb sculptures on them, meaning they were children's graves. It was all just still. No bugs, no wind. Jake was taking photos with his phone, trying to get artsy angles. Sarah started brushing moss off some of the stones to read them better. I walked out a little further, found a half-buried cast-iron fence that had once outlined part of the plot. I didn't touch it. It looked like it would snap apart if I breathed on it too hard. We stayed too long. It was hard to tell how late it was getting because of the shade, and our phones didn't have signal. Eventually, Jake checked the time and said it was after 6. The sun was already starting to dip behind the ridge. We packed up in a hurry and decided we'd have to move fast if we wanted to get back before it got fully dark. Sarah was nervous by then. She wanted to go back the way we came, but I said we should take the park road instead. It was longer but flatter, and wouldn't involve climbing back down those steep, eroded parts in low light. The main park road ran along a ridgeline that looped back toward the visitor center where we parked. It was paved, but not well maintained. We climbed up to it from the cemetery, cutting through dense underbrush for about 20 minutes before we finally hit asphalt. The sun was mostly down now, just a thin line of gold along the far edge of the trees. No streetlights, no signs of people, just a narrow road surrounded by tall trees. We turned left and started walking fast. About 15 minutes in, we passed one of those little pull-offs used for emergency parking or scenic overlooks. There was a rusted metal bench facing the trees and nothing else. Jake joked that it looked like the kind of place someone dumps a body. Sarah told him to shut up. I noticed broken glass near the bench, like a bottle had been smashed recently. It was dark green glass, still shiny, not weathered. That meant someone had been here. Recently. We didn't stop walking. The air was cooler now, and you could see your breath just a little, which didn't make sense because the day hadn't been that cold. The temperature had dropped too fast. Sarah put on her hoodie. Jake stayed ahead, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched. I kept looking behind us, even though I didn't hear anything. You know that feeling like you're being followed, but you can't prove it? That. The trees on both sides started to feel closer together, thicker. The road curved to the left, and we lost the last of the light. The sky went from blue to black in minutes. No moon. Just tree branches and asphalt. I took out my phone to use the flashlight, but the battery was at 2%. I told Sarah, and she handed me hers. Jake said he still had juice but didn't want to use his yet. Another pull-off came up on our right. This one had a trash can tipped over, trash scattered around like animals had gone through it. There was a sweatshirt lying next to it. Gray, dirty, no logos. Looked too clean to be there long. I asked if either of them saw a car pass us since we'd started walking. Sarah said no. Jake didn't answer. We kept moving. The woods were completely black now. Our footsteps were loud on the road. Sarah kept glancing behind her. Jake was walking faster than before. I wanted to tell him to slow down, but didn't. The flashlight beam hit something on the side of the road. Just a plastic water bottle, crushed. But next to it was a shoe. Just one. Brown hiking boot. Looked new. Size 11 maybe. No one said anything. We walked faster. Up ahead the road curved again, and just before the bend, I saw something on the asphalt. I slowed down. Sarah grabbed my arm. It was a pile of clothes, folded neatly. Jeans, t-shirt, socks on top. No shoes. Jake walked past it without looking. Sarah and I looked at each other. I started to say something, but she shook her head. We kept walking. The road ahead stayed empty and quiet, just the sound of our footsteps echoing on the cracked asphalt. No wind, no animals, just that hard silence between trees. It felt like we were the only people left in the whole forest. We kept moving fast, not running, but close. No one said much. The flashlight beam jumped across the dark road, sometimes catching a branch or the shine of a wet leaf. I kept checking behind us, even though there was never anything there. We'd been walking a while, maybe 30, 40 minutes, when we saw something up ahead. At first, it just looked like shadows, but then shapes started to form. 5 figures standing in the middle of the road. They weren't moving. We slowed down and stared. Sarah whispered, "Finally, someone else." Jake raised a hand and waved. I shouted, "Hey, do you know the way back to the parking lot?" No one answered. The group just stood there, completely still. Their clothes looked dark, maybe black or navy, and they were spaced evenly across the road, almost too evenly. No flashlights, no movement. Nothing. We stopped walking, unsure what to do. I called out again, louder. "Are you guys okay?" Still nothing. They didn't wave. They didn't even turn their heads. Sarah was gripping my sleeve now. Jake stepped in front of us and took a couple more steps forward. He said quietly, "Something's off." The sky was almost fully dark now, just a faint blue in the west. I moved the flashlight to the edge of the road, then back to the group. They were close enough now that we could see their outlines clearly. One was tall, 2 were shorter, maybe kids or women, but they all stood exactly the same way. Arms to their sides, facing us, waiting. We kept walking, slower now. The group didn't move. No talking, no gestures. Just 5 still figures in the middle of an empty road in the woods. Then, when we were maybe 50 feet away, everything changed. They broke apart. Without a sound, all 5 of them suddenly scattered. One ran left, into the woods. Another sprinted to the right. The rest split in different directions, some toward the trees, one toward the steep drop on the gorge side. It happened in less than a second. They were gone. Not walking, running. Full sprint, into the brush. No light, no sound, no sign of struggle. We froze. I turned the flashlight toward the forest line, trying to catch a glimpse of movement, but there was nothing. Just the beam cutting across branches and leaves. The road was completely empty again. "Where did they go?" Sarah said. Jake didn't answer. He just kept staring into the woods. The road at that spot had a sheer cliff face on one side and a steep gorge on the other. There wasn't any trail, no place to walk safely. I stepped toward the edge and looked down. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, not even broken branches. I said, "How'd they move that fast?" Jake shook his head. "They were just gone." We didn't wait around. We kept going, walking fast, nearly jogging now. Nobody said anything for a long stretch. It felt like the woods were watching us. I kept checking behind us, half expecting someone to step out of the darkness again. But we didn't see anyone. By the time we reached the parking area, it was fully dark. The lot was empty. Our car was the only one there. Even the ranger's vehicle that had been parked earlier was gone. I unlocked the doors fast and we all climbed in. Sarah locked her door before she even put her seatbelt on. Jake kept looking out the rear window while I started the engine. Nobody talked during the drive back to the cabin. The silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like something was following us, even though we didn't see anything. The road out of the park was narrow and winding, and I kept checking the mirror like I expected to see someone running behind the car. The next morning, after a restless night, we checked the park's website. That's when we saw the alert. A group of 5 hikers had gone missing the day before. They were last seen around the Southern Ridge Trails, near the gorge, same area we had been in. The post said they'd been due back at their vehicles before dark, but never returned. A search had gone on all night. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers. No trace found. They didn't post names or photos yet, just a warning asking hikers to report any signs or encounters. I remember staring at the screen for a long time. 5 people. Same number. Same area. Same night. Sarah said what we were all thinking. Was that them? Jake leaned forward, reading the alert again. But why wouldn't they say something? Why would they run? It didn't make sense. If they were lost, we could have helped. We had lights. We were heading back to the lot. Why would they run from the only help they might have had? We thought about calling the park rangers to report the encounter. But what would we even say? That 5 people stood silently in the road, then disappeared like shadows. That we didn't try to follow them? That we let them go? We never did call. They posted a follow-up a week later saying the search had been suspended. Still no trace. They called it a cold case. No evidence of animal attack. No gear found. No remains. Just 5 people who vanished in the woods. I think about it more than I should. Sometimes late at night I replay the moment when we first saw them standing there. What if we'd approached faster? What if we'd yelled louder? What if we'd followed them? The image of them scattering into the forest still sticks in my head. The way they moved. Silent. Fast. Deliberate. Like they weren't confused. Like they knew exactly where they were going. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know who those people were, or why they ran. But I think we saw the missing hikers. I think we were their last chance. And we didn't do enough. I can't forget that. I don't think I ever will. When I was 28 and working as a nurse in Detroit, I drove out to New York to help Laura move out of the apartment she'd shared with her ex-husband. She was going through a rough divorce and didn't have any family nearby, so I told her I'd come down for a few days and help with packing and driving back. The drive to New York was mostly uneventful. I left early on a Thursday morning, passed through Ohio, where I got pulled over by highway patrol for a broken headlight. The officer wasn't rude, just firm, and told me to get it fixed as soon as possible or risk a fine if I got stopped again. I went to a small shop near the next exit, and they replaced the bulb in about 20 minutes. After that, I made it through Pennsylvania and into New York without any issues. Laura had already boxed most of her things by the time I arrived. It was mostly clothes, kitchen stuff, and some framed photos she hadn't been able to throw out yet. Her ex had already moved out, and the place felt half abandoned. We loaded everything into the trunk and back seat of my sedan, her couch and larger furniture she said she was leaving behind. We set off around 5 p.m. the next day, hoping to get as far as we could before needing to stop for the night. She was tired and quiet during most of the drive, just resting her head against the window and watching the trees pass by. By around 10 p.m., we were deep into western Pennsylvania and agreed to find a safe place to stop for the night. Neither of us wanted to pay for a hotel. We figured a big 24-hour supermarket parking lot would be fine, somewhere with decent lighting, a few cars around, maybe some cameras. I remembered reading that truckers and travelers did this all the time. We pulled off near a mid-sized town and found a shopping plaza with a grocery store that had a huge open parking lot. It was mostly empty, except for a few cars scattered toward the front. We parked near a light pole, cracked the windows a bit, and turned the seats back to try and get some sleep. I was starting to doze off when I noticed something weird. 2 vans were parked across the lot, way at the far end, away from the store and other cars. Both had tinted windows and were running. Engines on, lights off. At first I thought maybe delivery drivers were on break or something, but they didn't move. I nudged Laura and pointed them out. She squinted and said maybe we were just tired and imagining things. But then one of the vans shifted slightly, like someone inside leaned forward or maybe got out of the passenger side. It was hard to see from that distance, but I suddenly felt cold. I turned the ignition and sat up straighter in my seat. Something about those vans didn't feel right. They were angled just enough to have a clear line of sight to most of the lot, including us. I watched them for another minute, not blinking, then put the car in gear and pulled slowly toward the exit. As we passed closer to them, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the driver's seat of one of the vans, staring directly at us. No phone, no food, just staring. No attempt to move or even pretend not to be watching. I didn't say anything to Laura until we were back on the road. We drove another 10 minutes to a different part of town and found another grocery store parking lot, smaller but still lit. We parked again and sat quietly for a few minutes. There was only one other vehicle this time, a white Jeep parked in the far corner, also with tinted windows. No movement, but its engine was running too. I didn't like it. I told Laura I had a bad feeling again. She laughed a little, tried to brush it off, said I was being paranoid. I could tell she was trying to keep things light, but I noticed she started checking her window more often. I decided to test something. I pulled out of the lot, drove down the block, then looped back on a side street that passed behind the shopping plaza. As we came around the back and looked through the trees, we could see the white Jeep pulling out too. It didn't turn onto the main road. It drove halfway toward the exit, stopped, and sat there. Engine still running, brake lights glowing red in the dark. I didn't say anything at first. I just kept driving. Laura finally asked, "Are we being followed?" I didn't answer. I took a longer loop back onto the highway and kept checking the mirror, watching for that Jeep. We didn't see it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Laura looked over at me and said, "Okay, fine. Let's just find somewhere with other people around." We didn't try any more empty parking lots after that. At the third parking lot, we didn't even get the engine off before the white Jeep Compass from earlier pulled in behind us. I remember how slow it moved as it rolled through the lot, like the driver was scanning for us. Then it made a sharp turn and parked right next to us, despite the entire lot being basically empty. Dozens of open spots, and he chose the one right beside our car. Laura stared straight ahead, frozen. I turned slightly and looked. The guy behind the wheel looked young, maybe early 20s, but rough. Thin face, twitchy movements, unshaven. His hoodie was up, but I could still make out his expression. Angry, hollowed-out eyes. He looked like the kind of guy who hadn't slept in days. His hand was resting on the steering wheel, tapping. He wasn't pretending to shop. He wasn't going anywhere. He was watching us. I put the car in gear without saying a word and pulled out. We didn't speed. I just rolled out of the lot like nothing was wrong, taking a right back toward the main road. I checked the mirror and saw him follow. Laura gasped when she noticed the headlights right behind us. She kept looking over her shoulder, then back at me. "Is he following us?" I nodded. "Yeah." "What does he want?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know, but we're not going to wait around to find out." He stuck close. Too close. Barely a car length behind us, even when I changed lanes or turned. I thought maybe if I looped around or got back on the highway, he might back off. But he didn't. Every turn I made, he made. At one red light, he pulled up beside us for a second, and I saw him glance over. Not a long stare, just a quick check. Like he was confirming something. I turned down another road, and he followed again. No signals, no hesitation. Laura was starting to panic. Her breathing was quick, and she kept grabbing the door handle like she might jump out. I told her, "Don't freak out. I got this." She nodded, but her hands were trembling. I kept driving, trying to think. We were deep into the rural part of Pennsylvania by then. Nothing but dark roads, pine trees, and old motels. I didn't know if he thought we were someone else, or if he just saw two women alone and decided we were easy targets. Either way, I knew we couldn't let him corner us. I remembered something my dad once told me. He used to drive trucks through these areas and always said if you're in trouble, find a way to vanish. Not hide, just vanish. Get off the road fast and let whoever's following drive right past you. It had to be fast, and it had to be sudden. I looked for a road with no streetlights or signs. We passed a few turnoffs that were too exposed or too visible from the main road. Then I saw it. A narrow asphalt path with no marker, mostly swallowed up by brush. It looked like a private road, maybe one of those old access routes for hunting cabins. I flicked on the signal at the last second, cut the wheel hard, and turned in without slowing down. Branches scraped both sides of the car. It was barely wide enough for a single vehicle. We kept going about 50 feet. Then I killed the lights and coasted to a stop behind some trees. I cut the engine. We waited. 10 seconds later, we heard the Jeep's tires roar past the turnoff, engine still revving. He hadn't seen us. No brake lights, no hesitation. He just drove right by. Laura let out a choked breath. I don't think she realized she'd been holding it that whole time. We didn't say anything. I waited a full 5 minutes before starting the car again and reversing slowly out of the forest path. We pulled back onto the main road and took a different route toward a town I knew from childhood. About 30 minutes later, we found a small diner on the edge of a town that had a police station right across the street. There were 2 cruisers parked out front, lights off. It wasn't a busy place, just a little silver building with neon signs and 3 other cars in the lot. We parked in full view of the station, locked the doors, and stayed there until sunrise. Neither of us really slept. We sat there sipping cold coffee from a thermos and watching the front windows of the diner, then looking back toward the road every couple of minutes. No sign of the Jeep. No sign of anyone. When the sun came up, the road was empty. We drove the rest of the way to Detroit without stopping for anything but gas. The whole way back, we didn't see the white Jeep again. A few days later, after I'd caught up on sleep and tried to make sense of it all, I called the sheriff's office in the county we'd been in. I didn't expect much, just figured I'd report it in case it helped someone else. The sheriff was an older guy. Calm voice, no nonsense. When I gave him a brief summary, white Jeep Compass, tinted windows, aggressive tailing behavior, his tone changed. He asked me a few questions. What time, where, which road we were on. Then he told me something I wasn't ready for. He said there had been multiple reports over the past year of similar incidents, mostly women being followed at night. Lone drivers, small cars, especially out-of-state plates. The gang targeted travelers, usually in pairs or alone, waited for them to stop, then approached under the pretense of needing help or offering it. If victims stayed, things got violent. Robbery, sometimes assaults. One case even ended with a stolen car left in a ditch 3 counties over. The sheriff said the Jeep matched the description of one of the vehicles used in those attacks. "You did the right thing," he said. "You saw something off and you left. That's what keeps people alive." He told me we were lucky. He said most people try to wait it out. See if it's a coincidence. Pretend they're imagining things. But it's not always paranoia, he said. Sometimes it's exactly what you think it is. Laura and I didn't talk about it much after that. She moved into a new apartment and started seeing a therapist. I kept going to work, doing my shifts at the hospital, but I never parked overnight at another shopping lot again. Since then, I've learned to listen to that feeling, the one that tells you something's off. You don't need proof. You don't need a reason to leave. If it feels wrong, it is. That night taught me more than any safety class or police report ever could. Real predators don't look like monsters. They look like regular people, sitting in parked cars, waiting for someone who won't drive away fast enough. So when I was 24, I went on my first solo hiking trip in the Appalachian Mountains in Northern Virginia. It was late May. The weather was perfect, sunny but not hot, and the trees were just thick enough to cast long, cool shadows over the trails. I picked a beginner-friendly camping area near Skyline Drive. A ranger at the visitor center pointed me toward a spot that usually had other hikers around. That was important to me. I didn't want to be totally isolated out there, at least not on my first solo trip. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked, and hiked about a mile to set up my tent. The area had a few designated fire rings and flat spots tucked under tall pine trees. By evening, there were maybe 6 or 7 other tents set up within a 100-yard radius. It felt good to be around others but still have space. As the sun dropped behind the hills, a few people started fires. I ended up joining a small group of other hikers around one of them. We shared snacks, talked about trails, gear, and weather. It felt easy. One guy stood out, Danny. He was probably mid-30s, dressed like someone who knew his way around the woods. Solid boots, broken-in pack, headlamp already around his neck. He talked like a local and said he'd been hiking these mountains for over 10 years. He had a way of explaining things that made you want to listen. How to identify a copperhead, what to do if you ran into a bear, where to find clean spring water. The rest of the group faded out one by one, heading to their tents, but Danny stuck around. We talked more, about cameras, hiking alone, the smell of the woods at night. Just before I got up to leave, he said, "Hey, you brought a camera, right? Want to see a waterfall that's not on the maps? It's about 30 minutes from here. Nobody ever goes there. You'll get some great shots." At first, I said I didn't have a flashlight, but he pulled one from his side pocket and said, "I've got extras. Trust me, it's worth it. Sun's still got about 40 minutes left, and we'll be back before dark." I hesitated. I didn't usually follow strangers off trail, but this didn't feel dangerous. Danny had been nothing but polite and helpful. He smiled a lot, but not in a weird way. I said okay. I left my bag in the tent and only brought my camera, flashlight, and a water bottle. He led me to a narrow footpath that split off from the main trail. It was faint, like it hadn't been used in a while. Within a few minutes, I couldn't hear the other campers anymore. Just birds and the crunch of dry leaves under our boots. The path got tighter the further we went, branches brushing our arms and legs. Danny kept talking, about how he'd found the spot by accident, about the rock formations around it, about the way the light hit the water at the right angle around sunset. We walked longer than I expected. The sun was definitely lower now, casting that orange tint across the treetops. I asked how much farther, and he said, 10 more minutes max. But 20 minutes passed. No waterfall. The path had dissolved into patches of packed dirt and flattened brush. I kept glancing back, trying to remember which way we'd come. "You sure we're close?" I asked. "Positive," he said. "Just up ahead. Don't worry." There was something different about his tone that time. Less casual, more clipped. He stopped talking after that, except to say, "Watch your step," when we crossed a slick patch of moss. I started to feel it then, not panic, but a tightening in my chest. I kept looking around, trying to see some landmark, anything familiar. But it was just trees, brush, and dirt, sloping downward and away from any marked trail. We came to a small clearing, no waterfall, just a circle of rocks and what looked like an old fire pit. I asked again, "This it?" And he said, "No, just stopping for a second." He took off his pack and sat down on a flat rock. I stayed standing. My water bottle was half empty, and I held it tighter without meaning to. The woods were quieter here. I hadn't heard a bird in at least 5 minutes. I checked my watch. We'd been walking close to 45 minutes now. I said, "I think I'm gonna head back. Getting dark." Danny didn't look up. He was unwrapping something, jerky maybe. He said, "You don't want to see it? We're almost there." "I'll pass. Gotta get back before I lose the trail." He looked at me then. Not angry, not surprised. Just quiet. Watching. "You sure?" he said. "Yeah." I turned and started back the way I thought we came. There was no obvious path anymore. I walked 10 feet, then stopped. I looked back to ask Danny if he could point me the right way, but he was still just sitting there, chewing slowly, watching me. I picked a direction and kept walking. The light was fading fast, and I flipped on the flashlight. Every branch that snapped behind me made me flinch. I didn't run, I didn't want to, but I walked faster. Every tree looked the same now. No markers, no sounds. Just my boots on the ground and my breathing, louder than it should have been. I stopped again after a few minutes, turned the flashlight behind me. Nothing. I listened. No steps. No voices. I kept walking, picking my way uphill this time, figuring if I stayed high, I'd spot the main trail. It felt like I walked forever before I finally saw a sign nailed to a tree. White paint peeling, pointing toward the campgrounds. I kept the beam on it like it might disappear. I didn't see Danny again that night. Didn't hear him behind me. When I got back to my tent, it was dark and quiet. Fires out. I locked myself inside the tent, heart still going way too fast. The others were asleep or gone. I stayed awake for hours, just listening. We were still maybe 20 minutes from full dark when Danny stopped talking completely. He walked a few steps ahead of me, never looking back, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He kept glancing over his shoulder every few seconds and checking his phone screen like he was waiting for a message. I asked him once if he had a signal, just making conversation, but he ignored the question and didn't even turn his head. After a while, I said we should head back. I wasn't interested in the waterfall anymore. I was more than ready to be back at camp, by the fire, near other people. He didn't answer, just kept walking forward. I repeated myself, louder this time. He finally stopped and turned slightly, not enough to face me. He said, "It's just ahead." His voice sounded off, dull, flat, like he was trying to keep me from leaving, not actually convincing me to stay. I said again, "It's getting dark. I'm going back." That's when he turned fully around and looked at me. His eyes weren't angry, but cold, disconnected. "Suit yourself," he muttered, and started forward again. I turned around, took 2 steps the way we'd come, then heard the shift in the leaves behind me, fast. I looked back. Danny had stopped. His hand was in his pocket, pulling something out. It caught a bit of light from my flashlight. A blade. Folding knife. He didn't even try to hide it. I didn't think. I just took off running. Branches whipped at my arms. I didn't care. My legs burned, but I pushed harder. Behind me, I heard him yell, loud and sharp, "Get back here!" His feet hit the trail hard, crashing through the brush. Then, "I swear to God, I'll catch you." I didn't look back again. I didn't want to see how close he was. I ran blind, following the dim light from my flashlight bouncing in front of me. The trail was barely visible now. I slipped twice, caught myself both times. The third time I almost went down a slope but managed to turn last second and keep upright. My breath came ragged. I thought my chest would explode. Still, I ran. After what felt like forever, I saw the faint flicker of a campfire through the trees. I veered toward it. Bursting into the clearing, I stumbled over a root and collapsed just yards from the tents. I heard voices. Someone shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" I scrambled to my feet and gasped, "He's coming. He has a knife. He chased me from the trail." The faces that had been relaxed moments ago all changed. They stood up, tense, scanning the trees behind me. One guy grabbed a walking stick and moved toward me. "Who's chasing you?" "Danny, the guy from the fire." He pulled a knife. People looked at each other. A woman said, "Who's Danny?" Another camper said, "You mean that guy who was sitting here earlier?" Someone else added, "I thought he was with you." No one knew him. No one had seen him set up a tent. There was no extra gear around the campsite. No pack. No sleeping bag. Nothing that showed he was ever part of the group. We kept the fire high and everyone stayed close. Someone offered me water. Another gave me a blanket. My hands were shaking too much to hold either. A guy named Rich pulled out his phone and tried calling the ranger station. He got a signal. They told us someone would come up from the station and arrive within the hour. We sat waiting, nobody saying much. I kept looking at the edge of the clearing, expecting him to come crashing through. But the woods stayed silent. He never showed. We never saw him again that night. When the rangers arrived, they took me aside and asked me everything. His name, what he looked like, where we walked, what happened. I gave them everything I could remember. One ranger, older guy with a lined face and heavy boots, nodded like he'd heard this before. After I finished, he said, "You're lucky." He told me Danny wasn't really Danny. He didn't know his real name. But this wasn't the first time someone had reported being lured off trail by a man who didn't belong to any group. The same description. Mid-30s, hiking gear, friendly, knew the woods too well. According to the ranger, this man had shown up in reports across multiple stretches of the Appalachian Trail, always around campsites, always slipping into groups, acting like he belonged. Then he'd target someone traveling alone or in a pair, offer to show them some hidden waterfall or overlook, and then lead them deeper, away from help. A few victims had been robbed at knife point. One guy had been tied up and left in a ravine. Another woman fought back and got away with a gash down her arm. Most never went far enough with him to find out what he really wanted. But no one had ever been able to get a name or a good photo. He vanished before law enforcement could reach the scene. They'd been trying to catch him for months, maybe longer. The ranger told me, "Don't beat yourself up. He's good at this. You figured it out in time." I didn't sleep the rest of that night, even with people nearby, even with rangers doing rounds and checking the area. I lay in my tent, listening to every twig snap, every gust of wind in the leaves. I left the next morning, packed up early and didn't say much to anyone. The forest felt different now, still and quiet, but with a kind of weight in the air. Like I'd woken up to a part of it I hadn't seen before. I never saw Danny again. Never heard any follow-up about whether they caught him. But I kept thinking about how easily I followed him, how normal he'd seemed, how quickly it could have gone the other way. I still go hiking sometimes, but not alone. Never again. And I never follow anyone off the trail, no matter how friendly they seem, or how good their story sounds. In the woods, trust isn't just dangerous, it can be deadly. When I was 29, Tom and I finally decided it was the right time to take the RV trip we'd been talking about for years. We had saved every extra bit of money for almost 2 full years, budgeting carefully, and when we finally bought a decent-sized travel trailer, it felt like a dream we'd actually earned. Our plan was simple: drive up and down the East Coast and stop at as many national parks and campgrounds as possible. The first couple of weeks were smooth, every stop just adding to the excitement. We were still in that stage where setting up camp and cooking simple meals outside felt new and refreshing. One evening, we pulled into a private campground near the Appalachian Mountains in Maryland. It was already edging towards sunset when we checked in, and the man at the small office gave us a printed map showing available sites. The place looked quiet. Not many campers around, just a few trailers parked far apart. That was exactly how we liked it. Enough privacy, but still people nearby if something went wrong. We chose a spot tucked close to a line of trees, shaded, and with enough space to spread out our chairs. We got to work setting up. Tom handled the heavier things like leveling the trailer and hooking up the water while I unpacked the kitchen supplies and sorted what we needed for the next day's hike. The evening air smelled faintly of pine, and apart from a couple of distant voices and the occasional crunch of gravel from someone's car, the whole campground felt hushed. By the time the sun dipped fully, we had the trailer ready. Tom grabbed his shower bag, saying he wanted to wash up before dinner, and left for the communal facilities, which were maybe a 5-minute walk down a paved path. I stayed behind inside the trailer. It wasn't completely dark yet, so I turned on only the small light above the kitchen counter and started organizing. I stacked food containers, rolled up maps, and set the hiking boots by the door. From the window, I could see the glow from the main office at the front of the campground, but between our trailer and there, it was just trees and dim patches of grass. It seemed calm, nothing unusual, but I remember feeling that the quiet was heavier than at other campgrounds we'd stayed in. That was when I heard the first knock. 3 short taps on the trailer door. I froze for a second, then walked over and checked through the peephole. There was nothing, just the dark outline of trees and empty gravel. I called out, "Who is it?" No answer. The knocking didn't repeat. After waiting half a minute, I figured maybe it was just some kid messing around, though I hadn't seen any kids when we arrived. I went back to arranging things, trying not to think about it. About half an hour later, it happened again. The same pattern of knocks, this time a little louder, then silence. I went back to the peephole and again saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, no one walking away. I hesitated longer this time and even unlatched the door just a bit, but thought better of opening it. That's when I noticed something different. On the far side of the trailer, a beam of light passed across the thin curtains of the bedroom window. Someone was outside with a flashlight. I grabbed my phone right away and called Tom. He answered after a couple rings, already walking back from the showers. I told him about the knocks and the flashlight. He didn't waste time asking questions, just told me to lock the door and wait until he got back. Less than 2 minutes later, I heard his footsteps crunching up to the trailer. He came in holding the baseball bat we always kept in the truck bed, then immediately stepped back out and circled the whole trailer slowly. I stood by the door, listening. I could hear him moving around, the gravel shifting under his boots, the occasional brush of branches as he checked near the trees. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. He said he didn't see anyone. No footprints, no beam of light anymore. Nothing disturbed. It was like whoever it was had vanished the second he showed up. Tom leaned the bat against the doorframe and told me to stay alert, but there was nothing else he could do. He grabbed his baseball bat and circled the entire trailer, but found absolutely nothing. We decided to move the trailer to a different spot, one farther away from the trees. Tom was convinced someone was hiding in the woods and messing with us. It didn't take long to pack up and tow the trailer across the campground. We picked a site closer to the main road that cut through the property, with a couple other RVs parked nearby. The area felt more open, the nearest tree line pushed back a good distance. I thought the change would put an end to it, but it didn't. Around midnight, just as I was dozing off, the sound of metal scraping against metal jolted me awake. The door handle was being tested, slowly and carefully, like someone was checking to see if it was locked. My pulse hammered as I grabbed Tom's arm. We both lay still, listening. Then footsteps circled the trailer, slow and deliberate. Windows rattled one by one, as if someone was checking for a weak latch. I covered my mouth with my hand to keep from making a sound. Tom slid off the bed, his face hard, and reached for the baseball bat again. He whispered that he was going to step out and deal with it, but I begged him not to. I was certain there was more than one person out there, and if he left the trailer, I'd be alone and unprotected inside. After a tense minute, he nodded and put the bat down. We both agreed on the spot to move again, this time closer to the entrance where the floodlights stayed on all night. Within minutes, we had the trailer hitched and were rolling across the gravel roads, the headlights bouncing across the empty campground. We pulled into a spot directly across from the small office near the gate. It felt safer being under the glow of the security light, and from there, we could see any car coming in or leaving. We kept the trailer lights on and switched on the small radio, letting it play quietly in the background. Neither of us said much. The silence outside felt heavy, broken only by the hum of the radio and the occasional insect buzzing against the window screen. It was sometime after 3 when Tom shook me awake. He motioned for me to stay quiet and pointed toward the narrow window by the door. My stomach dropped. 2 men were crouched just feet away, their backs bent low, their hands working at our lock with precise movements. The tools glinted in the light. These weren't kids pulling a prank. They were organized and steady, focused only on the deadbolt. Tom grabbed his phone and dialed 911. He kept his voice low, giving the dispatcher our exact location while never taking his eyes off the door. I fumbled for my phone and our wallets, stuffing them into a backpack in case we had to make a run for it. The dispatcher said officers were on the way, but warned it could take at least 10 minutes. 10 minutes felt like an eternity as the metallic clicks outside went on, the men whispering to each other in short bursts. We didn't move, just sat frozen on the bed, staring at the shadowy outlines through the curtains. Every second stretched longer than the last. I imagined the deadbolt giving way, the door swinging open, and the 2 men stepping inside. Tom held the bat tight in his other hand, his knuckles white around the handle. Neither of us spoke, barely even breathed. The only sounds were the faint scrape of tools and the radio murmuring some late-night DJ's voice. At last, the distant wash of sirens reached the edge of the campground. The men stopped instantly, like animals sensing danger. One whispered something sharp, then both bolted. We heard their footsteps pound across the gravel, then fade as they vanished into the trees. By the time the first cruiser's headlights swept the campground, the men were gone. 2 officers met us at the trailer, one shining his flashlight across the lock where fresh scratch marks lined the metal. They took our statements while another patrol car circled the property, but the woods swallowed whoever had been there. Nothing turned up. The officers assured us they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they'd seen this kind of thing before. Morning came gray and cold. The campground manager showed up at our site, looking uneasy. He admitted this wasn't the first time it had happened. Groups from nearby towns had figured out which campgrounds lacked proper security and would stalk the sites at night, targeting the newer RVs and trailers. They knew what to look for: expensive equipment, new tires, satellite dishes, anything that suggested money. He apologized for not warning us, saying it would have scared off too many customers. That only made Tom angrier. We didn't bother arguing. We packed everything up as quickly as possible, hooking the trailer back onto the truck before most campers were even awake. By 8 in the morning, we were pulling out through the gate, the campground shrinking in the rearview mirror. Neither of us spoke much on the drive, but the decision was made without words. From then on, we'd only stay in places with gates, cameras, or security on patrol. No more isolated sites, No more private campgrounds with no one watching. Even now, years later, I can't hear an unexpected knock at night without tensing. I still see those two crouched figures outside our trailer door, working the lock like it was nothing. We never returned to that part of Maryland again, and I don't think we ever will. When I was 31, I was really into hang gliding and would travel to different mountain ranges with my group of friends for informal competitions. We weren't professionals or anything, just a bunch of guys who loved flying and had enough money and free time to make it a regular thing. That particular weekend, we were at a place called Observatory Point in a remote stretch of the Appalachian Mountains. It was one of those sites you hear about through word of mouth. No signs, no designated parking, nothing official. Just a high, flat plateau that jutted out over a couple of valleys, offering long, uninterrupted winds and incredible views. We got in Friday afternoon and set up our tents in a natural clearing. There were 5 of us: me, Josh, Paul, Reggie, and Miguel. That night we stayed up late, eating freeze-dried meals and drinking cheap whiskey. The next day we flew for hours. The conditions were perfect. No turbulence, just steady lift from the warm air rising up the ridge face. We all took turns and watched each other from the cliff's edge. A couple of guys even had GoPros strapped to their helmets, but I didn't care about filming. I just wanted to be in the air. That night was louder. We were still riding the high from the perfect flights, and the drinking went longer. I turned in around 1, leaving the others still passing around a bottle and telling the same stories they always told. I knew I'd be the only one up early. That was fine with me. I liked being alone in the mornings, especially in places like that. I woke up just before 5, barely light out. Everything was quiet. You could still see the stars, but the horizon had just started to turn blue. I put on my boots and a hoodie and left the tent without waking anyone. I didn't make coffee or bring a flashlight. The air was still and cool, and it felt wrong to disturb it. About 100 yards from our camp, there was a rocky outcrop that curved outward like a natural balcony. I'd noticed it the day before but hadn't walked out to it. It took about 5 minutes of careful stepping through brush and stone before I reached it. I stood at the edge for a moment, testing the ground with my boot, then sat down on a flat patch of granite. The view was insane. Just mountains on top of mountains, the valleys still covered in mist. No sounds except a distant hawk call and some wind moving through the trees. I sat there without moving, not even shifting my weight. I just watched as the sky shifted from blue to purple to pink. The clouds over the ridges turned orange, and then the sun started peeking up. It was one of those moments where you forget about everything else. I wasn't thinking about my job, or money, or even the guys back at camp. I just sat there, still and breathing slow. Every so often a bird would fly by, silhouetted against the sky. One landed somewhere behind me, but I didn't turn around. I was focused on the valley and the light and the slow change in temperature as the sun climbed higher. After maybe 45 minutes or so, I started to hear more birds and a few faint cracks from the woods, branches settling, maybe a squirrel, the usual morning stuff. Still, the silence was mostly undisturbed. It felt good. I remember thinking about how moments like this made all the packing, the driving, and the cold tents worth it. Then I heard it. It came from directly behind me, not far at all, maybe 30 or 40 feet back. It sounded mechanical, but not like anything I was expecting. The first thing that came to mind was a jet engine powering up, but it didn't roar. It was lower, deeper, and it built slowly like something winding itself into motion. It didn't rise and fall like a passing plane. It just stayed there, growing steadily louder. I turned around, slowly, not getting up yet. My first thought was that someone had brought some kind of machine, maybe a generator or a drone. But when I looked back, I didn't see anyone. No movement, no figures, no flashing lights, just trees and rocks. The sound didn't stop. It was still going, loud enough now that I could feel a slight vibration in my chest. I stood up, keeping my eyes on the trees. I scanned the ridge behind me, the trail I'd come from, the trees just past the outcrop. Nothing. The sound was getting more complex now, like layers building on top of each other. It wasn't random. There was some kind of pattern to it, like a machine adjusting itself, clicking into place. I stepped back a few feet from the edge, not taking my eyes off the tree line. I wasn't scared yet, but something was wrong. It wasn't just the noise. The birds had gone quiet again. Even the wind seemed to stop. That stillness from earlier wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Then something moved between the trees. About 50 meters away, just beyond the edge of the trees, something began to rise. At first, I thought it was a drone, maybe something small that someone had brought along. But this thing was huge. Quiet, too. The wings were jointed, like a bird's, but clearly mechanical. They folded once at the center and once again at the tips, each part moving smoothly and silently as it lifted into the air. There were lights along the edges, not bright, more like a dull green glow that pulsed slowly. Beneath the wings, the body of the aircraft was sleek and narrow, with no visible rotors or exhaust. It wasn't shaped like a plane or a helicopter, more like a stingray with wings. A figure sat or stood in the middle of it, wearing a dark suit that hugged their body. The helmet they had on was seamless. No glass, no openings, just a smooth reflective surface that caught the first rays of sun and turned them into a hard glare. I didn't move. The sound I'd heard earlier was coming from the machine, steady, low, controlled. It vibrated the rocks under my boots. The aircraft didn't roll forward or back. It just rose straight up like an elevator, the wings adjusting slightly as it climbed. Within seconds, it cleared the treetops. Another 2 seconds, and it vanished into the low cloud layer hanging over the mountain ridge. No trail, no smoke, just gone. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than half a minute, but it felt like I was stuck in that moment for a lifetime. I didn't take out my phone, didn't blink, just stared at the gap between the trees long after it disappeared. The air went quiet again, but not in a peaceful way. Just empty. Like whatever had been there had sucked all the life out of the place before leaving. I sat down again slowly, tried to breathe normal. I stared at the dirt between my boots and waited for something. An echo, a jet roar, anything. But there was nothing. No one came running, no alarms, not even a hint that something out of the ordinary had just happened right in front of me. The birds hadn't come back yet either. I stayed there another hour, maybe more. I watched the clouds thin out, saw the sun rise higher, but didn't hear or see another thing. Eventually I stood up, stretched out my legs, and walked back to camp. The trail looked the same, untouched. The trees weren't burned or disturbed. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would have thought I dreamed the whole thing. Back at camp, the guys were still passed out in their tents. A couple of them groaned as I passed by, but no one got up. I boiled some water, made a cup of instant coffee, and sat at the fire pit with my back to the wind. My mind kept replaying the moment the aircraft lifted off. The movement was too perfect, the quiet, too precise. It wasn't built for human use the way we understood it. It didn't need runways or rotors or any of the normal noise we're used to from engines, and the person flying it, or piloting it, or controlling it, never looked around, never hesitated, just rose up and vanished. I thought about telling the guys, about saying I saw something take off out there, but I didn't. They'd ask if I'd been drinking. They'd make jokes about aliens or government black sites. No one would take it seriously, so I said nothing. Just told them I had gone to see the sunrise and that it was worth the cold. When I got home, I started searching online. Not obsessively at first, just curious. I looked for aviation news, experimental aircraft programs, even UFO sightings, though I didn't believe that's what it was. Eventually, I came across a forum buried deep in a discussion thread about restricted airspace in Appalachia. Some people had posted blurry maps, references to unnamed sites, and what they claimed were sightings of unlisted test flights. One user talked about spotting a silent winged craft near a logging trail north of where we had been. Another mentioned radar interference in a valley 2 miles from Observatory Point. Most of the posts were old. Most had no replies. But I kept reading. Then I found a small document scan, leaked or fake, I couldn't tell, of a Department of Defense memo from the late 90s referencing a vertical liftoff surveillance platform undergoing high-altitude environmental testing in the Blue Ridge region. The terminology didn't match civilian aircraft designs. It talked about adaptive wing articulation and non-rotor propulsion, neither of which meant much to me, but lined up with what I saw. I stopped reading after that. It became something I thought about late at night. Not every night, but often enough. I would lie there in the dark and replay the movement of those wings, the silence of the lift, the way the figure never looked down. I imagined surveillance cameras buried in the trees, watching, recording. I thought about what kind of data they collected, what kind of technology had to exist to make something like that, and why it wasn't public. I never went back to Observatory Point. Even when the others planned a return trip that fall, I passed. Told them I had work. Told them I wasn't feeling up to flying. It was only half a lie. Part of me wanted to know more. The other part knew better. I didn't want to be on any list. I didn't want a call in the middle of the night or someone knocking on my door. I didn't even want to drive near that part of the state anymore. I kept my mouth shut. Deleted my search history. Let the memories sink into the background of my life. Sometimes you go looking for peace and find something else. Something you're not supposed to see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You carry it. Quietly. For years. Maybe forever. So when I was in my early 30s, I considered myself a pretty experienced hiker and decided to tackle a section of the Appalachian Trail near Blue Ridge Mountain. I'd done dozens of day hikes over the years, but this was my first time trying a solo multi-day trip in a less frequented area. It felt like the right time to push myself a bit. I had my pack loaded with 4 days of food, a solid tent, extra water purification tablets, and a new GPS I was eager to try out. Everything was set, and I was looking forward to some peace and quiet in the woods. The first day went smoothly for the most part. Clear weather, quiet trail. Only a few other hikers passed by going the opposite direction. I covered about 12 miles before I stopped at a small shelter near a creek. The shelter was empty, which was unusual, but I didn't think much of it. I was more distracted by something else. The place looked a bit trashed. Someone had left a pile of empty cans near the fire pit, a bunch of cigarette butts crushed into the ground, and even some torn wrappers stuffed between logs. It pissed me off a little. I always carry out my trash, even toilet paper if needed, and seeing people treat the trail like that got under my skin. That night I didn't sleep great, not because I felt unsafe, but because I kept waking up to small noises, branches snapping, something moving through leaves. I figured it was just deer. Still, I kept my flashlight and knife close, just in case. The next day, I kept hiking north. I passed a few old Civil War sites, just historical markers and outlines in the dirt. But even those were littered with junk. Someone had tossed candy wrappers around one of the trenches, and I saw graffiti scratched into a tree nearby. That was when I started getting the feeling that someone was following the trail but not respecting it at all. Could have been a kid, or maybe just someone who didn't know better. But even beginners usually have more common sense than that. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed someone in the distance up on the ridge above me. It was just a flash of movement at first. Then I got a better look. It was a person, dressed head to toe in camouflage, just standing near the edge of the trail. I waved. They didn't wave back. When I kept walking and turned a corner, I looked back up, but they were already gone. I figured they just didn't want to chat. It's not that unusual, but still, something about it felt off. Like they were watching me, not hiking. That night, I used another trail shelter, this one cleaner but still empty. I kept thinking about the guy in camo, wondered if he was hunting illegally or just a loner who liked the woods. I made sure to keep everything locked down tight, no food out, bear bag hoisted high, knife next to the sleeping pad. Day 3. I veered off a bit, taking one of the blue-blazed side trails to loop around a section I'd already hiked years ago. I didn't see anyone that whole day, which was fine. I liked the solitude. Around sunset, I found a decent spot with a clear patch of sky and decided to sleep under the stars. I laid out my bag and pad, set up a perimeter of small twigs so I'd hear if anything got too close, and made a small fire just for warmth. I was out for maybe 3 hours when I woke up. No animal sounds, no wind, just this low mechanical hum cutting through the silence. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but I sat up and realized it was real. A steady, dull droning sound coming from somewhere in the woods. Not close, but not far either. I couldn't pinpoint the direction. It wasn't loud, but it felt constant, like a machine that had been left running underground or behind a hill. Not like a chainsaw or a car, more like an engine at idle, just humming along with no change in tone. I got up, shoved my feet into my boots, and killed the fire. I just stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening. The sound didn't move, didn't stop. I turned off my headlamp and tried to adjust to the dark, hoping my eyes would catch something. Nothing. Just that sound in the distance and the stillness of the woods. I'd heard rumors before, mostly online, about meth labs or grow sites hidden deep in the Appalachian forests. Usually way off trail, protected by cameras or booby traps. That was the only thing I could think of when I heard that noise. Something industrial. Something that shouldn't be there. I considered packing up right then, but the risk of getting turned around in the dark wasn't worth it. So I moved about 50 yards from where I'd originally laid out, tucked myself between some thick trees, and slept in full gear with my knife in hand. The humming never got louder, but it didn't stop either. When the sun came up, I packed fast and didn't even eat. I just wanted to get moving. The sound had faded with the morning bird song, like it had never been there. But I didn't forget it. And when I got back on the main trail, I noticed something new. Fresh boot prints. Not mine. Someone else had passed through in the night. I didn't want to risk encountering criminals or getting caught up in something dangerous, so I quickly packed my gear and hiked away from the sound. I didn't even eat breakfast. Just grabbed my pack, double-checked for anything I might have left behind, and got moving. The humming stayed steady for a while as I followed the trail uphill, but I could tell it was behind me now, lower in elevation. I pushed hard for about 2 hours, not stopping, not slowing down, just trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that sound. Eventually it faded into nothing, replaced by wind and birds and the usual forest noise. I didn't feel completely safe, but I was less on edge. Later that day, clouds started rolling in fast. I checked my GPS and knew there was a wooden trail shelter about 5 miles ahead. I kept moving through light rain that turned heavy quickly, and by the time I reached the shelter, I was soaked. It was already occupied. 3 other hikers were huddled inside, all of us dripping wet and looking miserable. We exchanged quick nods, not much talking. After an hour of listening to rain pound the roof, someone brought up ordering pizza. It sounded ridiculous at first, but we were less than 2 miles from a trailhead parking lot with a road leading to town. Somebody had signal, looked up a place, and called. The first driver pulled in about 40 minutes later, but as soon as he saw us, 4 soaked, bearded, muddy strangers in the dark woods, he turned around and drove off without a word. The second guy, a younger dude in a busted sedan, showed up maybe an hour later and laughed when he saw us. Said he delivered out here all the time, handed over 4 boxes, took his tip, and peeled off. We ate fast. Nobody said much after. We just sat there, listening to the rain and chewing. That night, I didn't sleep deep. My mind kept going back to that droning noise and whoever had been out there. By the next afternoon, the weather cleared, and I was less than a day from the town of Harperstown. The trail was quiet. No more sightings of anyone in camo, no more strange noises. I passed a few other hikers heading the opposite direction, but none mentioned anything unusual. As I got closer to town, I slowed down. I was planning to stay one more night in the woods before heading in. About a mile before the old Schaffer shelter, I saw 3 elderly locals standing near a small dirt road that crossed the trail. They weren't hiking, just standing there like they were waiting for someone. One of them waved me down and asked if I was planning to stay at the shelter ahead. I said I was, since I didn't feel like pushing all the way into town that evening. All 3 of them seemed uncomfortable when I said that. One woman, probably in her 70s, looked directly at me and said, "You shouldn't stay there. You look like a smart man. You'd be better off moving on." I asked why, but they didn't give any explanation. Just kept saying it wasn't a good place to spend the night. When I asked what the issue was, another of them just shook his head and said, "Nothing good ever happened there." I thanked them, said I appreciated the warning, and moved on. I'll admit it got under my skin. But the shelter was close, and the sun was already low. I didn't want to rush the last few miles into town in the dark. I figured maybe they were just superstitious. The Schaffer shelter was in bad shape. It was one of those old designs, low ceiling, creaky wood, not much room. There was a newer shelter being built maybe 100 yards away, but it was just a frame and a foundation. The old one was still standing, barely. I set up inside and tried not to think too much about what the locals had said. I didn't light a fire, just unrolled my bag, ate some jerky, and listened to the wind. That night the wind slammed into the walls hard enough to rattle the whole frame. The roof creaked and shifted. At one point I got up and checked that it wasn't about to collapse on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. No footsteps, no voices, nothing like that. Just a wrong kind of silence, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The next morning, I broke camp fast and followed the trail the rest of the way into Harperstown. My clothes still smelled like smoke and mildew from the shelter. I stopped at the post office to ask about a package I had waiting and ended up making small talk with the clerk, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a trail guide hanging from her neck. When I mentioned I'd stayed at the Schaffer shelter, her smile faded. "You shouldn't have stayed there," she said. I asked her what the story was, because I figured I'd finally get a straight answer. She looked around and then leaned forward a bit. Few years ago, 2 hikers got murdered there. They met some guy at a bar in town, had a few drinks, seemed friendly. Next morning, they never checked out of their hotel. Turns out he followed them onto the trail, waited until they were asleep in that shelter and killed them both. She said it like she'd told the story before. Like everyone in town already knew it. They caught the guy eventually, she added. Local man. Said they reminded him of someone. That was his excuse. I just nodded, not sure what to say. Locals wanted that shelter torn down right after, she continued. But money's tight. They started on a new one, but it's slow going. That's why the old one's still there. But people around here don't like anyone sleeping in it. Bad history. I thanked her, picked up my package, and walked out. Later, while eating lunch on a bench near the visitor center, I thought about how close I had come to something worse. I wasn't superstitious, but when 3 people you've never met try to steer you away from a place, it probably means something. I'd brushed it off because I was tired, because it was convenient. But I'd slept in the same spot where people had died, and the people around here hadn't forgotten. You can hike hundreds of miles, carry the best gear, follow every rule, and still not know what's waiting down the trail. The maps don't tell you everything. Sometimes the danger isn't the weather or the terrain or wild animals. It's the parts of the past that haven't been cleaned up, still sitting there quietly in the woods, waiting for someone else to lie down for the night. It happened last fall when I was 28 and working as a freelance photographer for a travel magazine. I had just spent a week in the West Virginia Appalachian Mountains shooting autumn landscapes. I was alone most of the time, waking up early to hike into overlooks before sunrise, then chasing light all day until the shadows got too long. My back seats were folded down for all my gear: tripods, lenses, waterproof cases, a drone, batteries, memory cards, you name it. Probably over 15 grand worth of equipment in total. It wasn't exactly high security, but I kept everything locked and out of sight. That Friday, I had planned to drive back to Richmond after a full day in the field. But a generator issue in Lewisburg cost me almost 6 hours at a mechanic's shop. They were friendly enough, but slow, and I didn't get on the road until just after dark. I was tired, wired on gas station coffee, and after an hour of driving, realized I probably wasn't going to make it home without either falling asleep at the wheel or pulling over somewhere. I didn't want to spend on a motel for just 6 or 7 hours, so I figured I'd find a campsite and just crash in the SUV. One of the guidebooks in my glove box listed a free campground about 8 miles off a dirt road. It wasn't a place I'd ever heard of, but the GPS found the turnoff. The road was rough and winding, gravel in some places, just packed dirt in others. After about 20 minutes of slow driving, the trees opened up into a clearing maybe the size of a soccer field. It was flat, scattered with rotting wooden picnic tables and rusted fire pits. The signs were barely readable, weathered to gray. No other cars, no tents, no people. I parked on the far side of the clearing, pointed toward the entrance. If something felt off later, I didn't want to be boxed in. I left the engine running at first while I took a walk around with my flashlight. Just a quick loop, checking for animals or anyone else who might be lurking. I didn't see or hear anything. The only noise was the engine clicking when I turned it off, and the wind in the trees. No crickets, no frogs, just wind. I locked all the doors, laid the driver's seat back, pulled my jacket over myself, and tried to sleep. I wasn't all the way out, just dozing off, when a bright set of headlights cut through the darkness like someone had turned the sun back on. I shot upright, my heart in my throat. A pickup truck had come in fast and was parked directly across the entrance to the clearing, blocking the only way out. Its engine was still running. The truck faced me, and both headlights were aimed straight into my windshield, blinding me. I shielded my eyes and sat completely still, I couldn't see anything past the glare, just the vague outline of the truck and two shapes in the front seat. They didn't get out right away. They just sat there with the engine idling and headlights beaming into me like they were waiting for something. 10 minutes passed. I kept checking my doors to make sure everything was still locked. I couldn't move the car without them blocking me. I thought about starting the engine, maybe flashing my high beams or hitting the horn, but something told me not to draw more attention. Then both truck doors opened at the same time. Two men stepped out. One had a hammer. The other had what looked like a crowbar. They didn't say anything at first. Just walked toward me slow and steady, casual like they had all the time in the world. I reached for my phone but couldn't find it immediately. I had shoved it under my seat earlier when I laid back, and now my fingers were fumbling in the dark, my eyes bouncing between the men and the shadows around the footwell. The guy with the hammer was the one who spoke first. He tapped it against my side mirror as he came closer and said, "Hey buddy, our truck broke down. Can you open up real quick?" I didn't answer. Just stared straight ahead and kept fumbling until my hand finally hit the edge of my phone. The second guy added, "We just need to use your phone. Or maybe borrow a jack. Just open up. We're stuck, man." He was already close enough to be at my door. He grabbed the handle and tried to yank it, even though it was clearly locked. He rattled it twice, then hit the window with the crowbar, not swinging hard, just enough to make a point. I got the phone unlocked and opened the keypad, but I had no signal. 0 bars. No service, no emergency call option. I glanced up and saw them both looking in, studying me through the glass. "Don't be stupid," the first one said. "You ain't got no choice." I held the phone up, tried to act like I was talking to someone already. I mouthed, "I'm calling the police," and then turned it toward them to show the screen, hoping they'd see the glowing keypad and maybe think I had backup on the way. They didn't move, just stood there like they were calculating something. The one with the hammer took a few steps back toward the front of my car, then leaned over and looked under it, like he was checking for something. The other one walked behind me, out of view. I kept the doors locked, keys in the ignition now, foot over the brake. I didn't want to floor it and get stuck against their truck, but I wasn't going to sit there waiting for them to make the next move either. Behind me, I heard the soft sound of a hand tapping on the rear window. I didn't look. I just reached forward and started the engine. The crowbar struck the driver's side window hard enough to make the glass bend and crack. It didn't shatter, not yet, but spiderweb fractures spread across the surface in a second. I ducked low and started yelling into the phone. "They're breaking in! I'm trapped in my car!" The dispatcher told me again that units were en route, but the location was rural and it could take 20 minutes or more. I looked at the cracked window, the crowbar already lifting again, and said, "I don't have 20 minutes." The man with the hammer was working on the rear passenger window now, slamming down repeatedly. The glass shook, flexed, and cracked again. It wouldn't hold much longer. The other guy was under my hood. I saw the shape of his boots sticking out from the front. He had popped the latch somehow. The headlights flickered and then died, and the dash lights followed. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. If they killed the ignition next, I was done. I didn't have time to think. I reached down and laid on the horn, long and loud, over and over. The guy at the window yelled, "Shut that off!" and raised the crowbar again. I didn't stop. The sound was deafening in the cabin, but I kept pressing the horn, punching it like it was the only thing that could keep me breathing. My whole car was vibrating now, glass creaking like it was ready to explode inward. Then I heard it. Over the blaring of the horn and the banging of metal, a new sound broke through. It was low at first, like distant thunder, then clearer. An engine. Not mine. Not theirs. A motorcycle. It came fast, ripping through the quiet trees with a rising pitch, headlights bouncing across the brush line. One of the men shouted, "Shit!" and jumped back from my window. The guy under the hood scrambled out and slammed it shut without securing it. "Let's go!" he yelled, sprinting toward the pickup. Their truck engine revved high, and they reversed in a wide, jerky arc, dirt flying from the tires. I could see their silhouettes outlined in the red glow of their taillights as they tore out of the clearing. The motorcycle burst into the opening seconds later, the headlights sweeping across my SUV. It stopped hard a few yards away, engine still rumbling. The rider didn't speak at first. He looked at me, saw I was okay, then turned his head toward the retreating sounds of the truck disappearing down the dirt road. He was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, dressed in a canvas jacket and helmet. He pulled off one glove and pointed to my window. I lowered it halfway, the cracked glass making a grinding noise. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded. "They tried to break in." He looked around the clearing, then shut off his bike engine. "Heard your horn from my camp about half a mile back. Figured something wasn't right." I looked at the broken glass, the scuffed crowbar marks, the still flickering dash. They were trying to disable the car. I couldn't move. "Call the cops?" "Yeah. They said they're on the way, but it'll be a while." The man nodded again. "All right. I'll stay here with you until they show up." We didn't talk much. He parked the bike behind my SUV and stood nearby, arms crossed, scanning the trees. I sat inside, phone shaking in my hand, headlights still off. About 15 minutes later, red and blue lights came bouncing through the forest and 2 state troopers pulled up in a cruiser. They took my statement, then spoke to the biker. I didn't hear much of what they said, but they took his contact information and mine, then turned their focus to tracking the truck. The biker stayed long enough to make sure I was set, then said he needed to head out. I tried to thank him again, but he just shrugged, straddled the bike, and rode off into the dark. 2 days later, a detective from the local sheriff's department called me to follow up. They had caught the 2 men that morning, about 40 miles south, trying to run a similar scam on a van full of European hikers. One of the hikers got their license plate as they pulled in, and that's what did them in. "These guys been hitting spots like that for months," the detective said. "Always late at night, always when people are alone. We think they target folks with gear, photographers, campers, anyone they think has something worth stealing." He told me they'd been arrested twice before on related charges, but always in different states. This time they had tools in the truck and stolen goods from another victim, enough to stick. "You're lucky," he said. "They've hurt people before. Busted open a guy's head with a pipe near Marion back in August. He was sleeping in his car too." I didn't sleep much the next night. Every sound outside my apartment made me jump. I kept thinking about how close I came to losing everything. Not just the gear, but my safety. I thought about the biker. How fast he'd acted. How he didn't ask for anything. Just showed up when it mattered. I never found him again. Didn't know his name. Didn't see him in the papers. But I owe him something I don't think I can repay. Since then, I haven't camped alone. Not in a car. Not in any place without a verified lot, cameras, or other people nearby. I stopped trusting old guidebooks and started double-checking every location on forums and recent reviews. I tell someone my route every time now, text them when I arrive and when I leave. That night in the mountains could have gone a lot worse. I still think about how quiet it was in that clearing, right before the truck pulled in. How alone it felt. How fast everything changed. I decided to take a 4-day solo hike on the northern section of the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania last October. It was something I had thought about doing for a while, and with the way things had been going at work, tight deadlines, late nights, meetings that never ended, it felt like the right time to unplug. I figured 4 days in the woods without emails or phone calls might help clear my head. I drove up early Friday morning, parked near a trailhead close to Port Clinton, and started walking north with my pack, water filter, tent, and food for the trip. The first day was peaceful. The trail was quiet, with only a few other hikers passing by, all of them going the opposite direction. I didn't mind the solitude. That was the point. The leaves had just started to turn, and the crisp air was perfect for hiking. I made it about 10 miles before deciding to stop for the day. There was a small clearing about 200 yards off the main trail, tucked into a patch of dense woods. No fire pit, no signs anyone had camped there before. It felt out of the way, which I liked. I set up my tent, made a small meal with my camp stove, then read until dark. I didn't even hear any animals that night. No raccoons or deer snuffling around. Just silence. I slept hard. But when I got up the next morning and stepped outside, something was off. There were boot prints around my tent, clear ones. I followed the path they made. They didn't approach from the trail directly. They came in from the east, looped around the back of my tent, made a full circle, and then exited heading west toward the main trail again. I crouched down and looked at them more closely. They were fresh, from the night before. The edges hadn't been worn down by wind or morning dew yet. They were bigger than mine, too. Maybe size 11 or 12. I wear a 9.5. I hadn't heard anything. No crunching leaves, no snapping branches. Whoever it was, they walked all the way around me while I was asleep and then left without making a sound. I tried to stay calm, told myself maybe it was just another hiker who saw my tent and walked around it to avoid waking me. But why leave the trail and come so far into the woods for that? And why wouldn't they say anything? I didn't take much time breaking camp after that. I packed everything up faster than usual and got back on the trail by 7:30. I didn't see anyone else all morning, which wasn't unusual, but it kept my nerves on edge. I kept looking behind me every few minutes. At one point, I even stopped and waited quietly, just listening. Nothing. Still, I kept moving. By the afternoon, I figured I'd gone about 12 miles. I didn't want to camp anywhere near the main trail that night, not after what I saw that morning. Around 5, I found a steep ridge that led down into a thick, uneven valley. There was no trail down there, but it was full of large rocks and fallen trees. Good cover. I made my way down, off trail, bushwhacking through a half-mile of brambles before finding a good flat spot under some pine trees. I spent more time than usual camouflaging my tent with branches and made sure the fire pit I built was small, barely big enough to boil water. It felt safer that way. The sun went down by 6:45, and by 9, it was pitch black. I had my headlamp off and was just sitting in the tent, listening to a podcast I'd downloaded. That's when I heard footsteps again. It was the crunching sound of dry leaves and twigs. Slow. Heavy. Not like a deer. This was deliberate. Too slow and careful to be a wild animal. They came from the direction I'd entered the valley, up from the ridge. I switched off the podcast immediately and waited. The sound continued. Closer. One step. Pause. Another step. I reached for my flashlight and knife. It was a heavy folding knife, the only one I brought. My hand was shaking, but I kept the blade open and ready. I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to poke the flashlight through and turned it on. The beam lit up the trees in front of me. Branches, pine needles, the ground littered with orange leaves. Nothing. The footsteps stopped the moment the light came on. I waited, slowly sweeping the flashlight side to side. Still nothing. I listened hard, tried to hear retreating footsteps, the snapping of branches, but there was only silence. I stayed like that for a long time, just listening. My arms started to ache from holding the flashlight up, but I didn't lower it. I didn't hear anything else. No movement, no sounds. Whoever had been there, they were still in the woods somewhere. They hadn't walked away. They had just stopped moving. For over an hour, I stood outside my tent, gripping the knife so tightly my hands started to cramp. I didn't care. The silence wasn't normal. No bugs, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just dead air, like the forest itself was waiting for something. I kept swinging the flashlight slowly across the tree line, breathing through my nose to avoid the sound of my own breath. I turned it off a few times to listen harder. Still nothing. I wanted to go back inside, but the idea of turning my back on the trees made my stomach turn. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing just past the reach of my light, watching, waiting. I paced around the fire pit, ears straining for any hint of movement. The shadows kept playing tricks on me. I kept thinking I saw something shift just outside the circle of trees, but when I swung the light back, there was nothing. Finally, after standing for too long, I tried to sit inside the tent, but it felt like being buried alive. I zipped it shut and sat still, but after a few minutes I couldn't take it. My skin crawled like ants were under it. I reached for the zipper to peek out again. That's when I heard the footsteps. Quick, heavy, sprinting. Directly behind the tent, I unzipped the flap and lunged out with the flashlight, heart in my throat, knife in the other hand. Nothing in front. But I heard the crashing of someone running away, heading deeper into the woods. They had been standing directly behind the tent, right there, listening. I didn't sleep. I dragged everything I could find to the campfire, fed wood to the flames, and sat there all night with the knife across my knees. Every few minutes I'd sweep the flashlight into the trees. I thought about making noise, yelling to scare them off, but something about the way they moved made me feel like that wouldn't work. They weren't scared. They were toying with me. By the time the sky started lightening in the east, I could barely feel my fingers. I stood up, stretched, and immediately started checking around the camp. Sure enough, fresh boot prints in the damp soil, right behind where the tent had been pitched. The same deep tread marks. Size 11. They led in from the ridge side, and then turned back the same direction. It hadn't been a hallucination. Someone had been there all night. I tore down camp in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything into my pack haphazardly, snapping straps and leaving trash behind. I just wanted to move. The first hour of the hike, I kept looking back every few minutes, practically jogging with the pack bouncing behind me. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. Not until I saw the first power lines near the highway, maybe 10 miles from town. When I finally reached the outskirts, I walked straight into the sheriff's office. I didn't even go to my car. I must have looked wild, mud on my face, eyes red, trembling. The deputy behind the desk didn't even flinch. He just listened quietly, then nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard this kind of thing. He asked a few specific questions. Where I camped, where the person stood, what the boot prints looked like. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're not the only one." Apparently they'd had calls like mine off and on for years. Solo hikers seeing shadows, hearing footsteps, finding things moved around. A man, local, probably in his 40s, had been spotted a few times but always vanished before they could catch him. Lived somewhere in the hills, maybe in a dugout or an abandoned structure. No one knew. He didn't have a known address or family. The deputy said they'd tried tracking him, even brought in dogs once, but he always disappeared before they got close. Knew the terrain too well. Grew up in the mountains, probably never left the area. I asked if he'd hurt anyone. Not yet, the deputy said. But he's getting bolder. Some hikers said he'd touched their tents while they were inside. Others reported waking up to find their packs unzipped, items missing or rearranged. One woman swore she woke up with him crouched outside her tent, just staring. She screamed and he ran off. They never found him. It hit me then how lucky I was. I sleep light, especially when I'm on edge. I probably moved around too much for him to try anything. But if I'd slept hard both nights, I didn't want to finish that thought. I gave them everything I could remember. What he sounded like, if I'd heard breathing, what direction he ran. They thanked me, said they'd send someone to check the area. I nodded, left, and drove straight home. I never went back to finish the section of trail. I still hike, but I never go alone anymore. Every time I zip up a tent, I think about the silence that night, the footsteps, the way he just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just listening. Sometimes I lie awake and wonder how many other tents he circled, how many hikers woke up just a second too late, and how many never woke up at all. When I was 17, my parents took me and my friend Amanda camping at Iron Mountain State Park in the Appalachians for a long weekend. It was our first time there, and I remember the drive up being long and winding through these narrow mountain roads that made my mom anxious the entire way. The campground itself wasn't anything fancy. Picnic tables, fire pits, a basic restroom building, and some hiking trails that disappeared into the woods. There weren't many people around, which my dad thought was great. He said it meant peace and quiet. The first 2 days were uneventful, just a lot of walking around the woods, cooking over the fire, and hanging out by the tent with my parents. Amanda and I shared one tent while my parents had their own. At night we played cards by flashlight, and the air got cold fast after the sun went down. On the last day, Amanda and I decided to walk down to the lake around 6:30 p.m. to catch the sunset. The lake was about a 15-minute walk from our campsite. We took the trail through the woods, carrying a bag with water, snacks, and our phones. It was quiet. You could hear the crunch of our shoes in the dirt and the occasional sound of birds or insects, but otherwise it was dead still. Once we got close to the lake, there was a small gravel parking lot with maybe 5 spots. There was only one car parked there when we arrived, a red Honda Civic with tinted windows. It was parked at a strange angle, slightly backed into a thicket with its rear end angled away from the drive. You couldn't really see the license plate unless you walked behind it, which neither of us did. It struck both of us as odd. Amanda said something like, "Why would someone park like that?" And I just shrugged. No one was in or around the car. We figured someone was hiking or maybe fishing. The air was getting cooler as the sun started to dip toward the mountains. Amanda and I sat on a bench near the water, took a few photos, and talked about school starting back up in a couple weeks. After maybe half an hour, we noticed how empty the whole area felt. The red car was still the only vehicle in the lot, and no one had come or gone. It was getting dark, and there were no lights near the water, just the orange sky reflecting off the lake. We stayed until the sun was almost gone, then decided to head back. Before heading to the trail, we stopped at the restroom building near the parking lot. It was a cinder block structure with 2 doors, one for men, one for women. The lights inside weren't working. I pulled my phone out and used the flashlight while Amanda waited. Then she went in while I stood outside. The building echoed with each sound: dripping water, a door hinge creaking, her footsteps. I remember standing there, looking around, and just feeling weird. I couldn't place it, but something felt wrong, like we were being watched. I even turned around and looked toward the red car again, but it was still just sitting there. No sign of anyone. As soon as Amanda stepped out of the restroom, this high-pitched alarm sound erupted from inside the building. It was a fire alarm, but not a typical one. It was way louder, shrill, and echoed off the trees like a siren. We both jumped and immediately started running away from the building. I thought maybe someone pulled the alarm as a prank or it was broken. My heart was pounding as we made it back to the gravel path that led into the woods. We were both laughing nervously, trying to play it off, but I could tell Amanda was rattled. We started walking back toward the campsite, phones out, flashlights on. The trail was narrow and cut through thick woods. No lights anywhere, and we had about a mile to go. Not long into the walk, Amanda stopped and whispered, "Do you see that?" I looked back, and she pointed behind us, off the trail. Through the trees, maybe 50 or 60 feet back, was movement. I squinted, trying to see, but it was too dark. I told her I didn't see anything. She said she thought she saw someone standing there. Tall, still, just off the trail. I waved my light around but saw nothing. We kept walking, a bit faster now. The trail was just wide enough for two people side by side, but we walked single file. I glanced back a few times and didn't see anything at first, but after maybe 5 minutes, I heard a sound, leaves crunching behind us. I stopped. Amanda stopped too. We both turned around and stood still, lights pointing back down the trail. Nothing. The crunching had stopped. It was too rhythmic to be an animal. Like footsteps, not scurrying. Heavy. Measured. I said, "Let's go." And we picked up the pace. We weren't running, but we were walking faster than before. Amanda kept glancing over her shoulder. I did too. The flashlight beam could only go so far, and everything outside of it was pure blackness. A few more minutes passed, and the footsteps returned. Closer this time. We didn't talk. We just started moving even quicker. At some point, I turned around and thought I caught a glimpse of something moving off the path behind a tree. It was just a flash, a shape in the beam. Could have been anything, but it made my chest tighten. We were about halfway back by then, and the trail twisted through some denser brush. The trees grew closer together, and the path narrowed. That's when Amanda whispered, "He's still behind us." I didn't answer. I didn't want to stop and look again. I just kept walking, focusing on the dirt in front of me. The sound of our own feet was drowned out by something else. Another set, slower, matching our rhythm. Every time we stopped, the footsteps stopped too. Amanda kept whispering, "He's copying us," over and over again. I shushed her, but I knew she was right. The sound was too deliberate. We'd walk, hear the crunch of leaves behind us, stop, and everything would go quiet. Then again, crunch, crunch, a few seconds after we moved. It felt like someone was toying with us, making sure we knew we were being followed without ever revealing themselves. I pulled out my phone. The battery icon was blinking red. I had maybe 5% left. I called my dad. He answered right away, and I tried to keep my voice calm, but I told him we thought someone was following us. I said we were about halfway back on the trail. He sounded annoyed at first, like he thought we were playing a prank, but then I think he could hear the panic in my voice. He said they'd come meet us right away. As we kept walking, Amanda grabbed my arm. Her hand was shaking. She didn't say anything. We just kept moving fast, not running, but barely holding back from it. I kept turning my head to shine the flashlight behind us, but I could never catch anything. Still, the footsteps were always there, just behind the edge of the light. I kept my phone screen off to save power. Every few minutes, I'd flick it on to check for texts. Nothing. Just a ticking battery and the time creeping by too slowly. We walked and listened. Always the same sound, never closer, never farther. Whoever it was, they were keeping a perfect distance, like they knew what they were doing. Then, finally, in the distance, 2 lights appeared, moving flashlights. My dad's voice called out our names, and I didn't even answer. We both just ran toward the lights. I felt Amanda grab my jacket like she thought if we let go of each other, something would pull one of us into the trees. When we reached my parents, I just said, "There's someone back there," pointing behind us. My mom hugged me, telling me it was okay now. My dad rolled his eyes, said it was probably a deer or someone else walking out late. He didn't understand. Nobody walking casually would match your steps for a mile through the woods at night. He told us to stay put with my mom while he walked back a ways with his flashlight. I watched the beam bounce as he disappeared down the trail. Amanda sat on a log with her arms around her knees. Neither of us said anything. My mom kept trying to explain it away. "It's a public park," she said. "People walk around. You girls scared yourselves." My dad came back about 10 minutes later, shaking his head. He said there was nobody out there. We were just spooked from that alarm, and maybe our imaginations ran off. But neither of us bought it. We hadn't imagined those footsteps. The next morning we started packing up to leave. I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about the trail, the noise, the figure Amanda said she saw behind the trees. I felt like we were being watched the entire night. Just this low buzz in my brain that wouldn't stop. While rolling up our sleeping bags, I glanced over toward the lot where other campers had parked. There, in a spot maybe 3 spaces from our campsite, was the red Honda Civic. Same dark tint, same awkward angle, facing us directly. I dropped the bag and pointed. "That's the same car, from the lake." Amanda came over and froze. She didn't say anything, just stared. It was definitely the same one. The angle it was parked made it clear. The driver could see everything we'd been doing the last 2 nights. The tent, the fire, us sitting out at the picnic table. I told my parents. My mom frowned but said someone probably just arrived late last night. My dad gave a half glance and said it looked like a lot of cars, didn't mean anything. They just wanted to get on the road and didn't want to think about it too much. We finished loading the car. As we drove out of the campground, I kept my head turned, watching the red Civic shrink in the mirror. I never saw who was inside. The windows stayed black. 2 weeks later, my mom called me into the living room while the local news was on. She had this look on her face like she didn't know whether to say something or just let me watch. The anchor was talking about arrests made at Iron Mountain State Park. A man had been caught stalking campers. He'd been reported for following women on trails, showing up near their camps at night, setting off fire alarms, then disappearing into the woods. They showed a blurry photo of the guy. Skinny, dark jacket, average height. But what really caught me was the car. The reporter said he drove a red Honda Civic with heavily tinted windows. My mom turned the volume down and just looked at me. Police said he'd been operating in the park for months, slowly gathering information on campers. Some people had reported him, but he'd never been caught until a family with 2 young kids had noticed him circling their tent at night. That finally triggered a bigger investigation. I didn't say much after that. Amanda texted me when she saw the story too. Just 1 sentence. I knew it wasn't in our heads. My dad didn't say much. I think he felt guilty for brushing us off. Later that night, he told me I did the right thing by calling. That the worst thing would have been to stay silent and hope we were wrong. Sometimes I still hear that sound in my head. Leaves crunching behind me, perfectly in sync. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, deliberate. I wonder how far he followed us. I wonder if he watched us from behind a tree as we ran to my parents. If he turned and walked away the second he saw the flashlights. If he ever planned to step closer. And I wonder what would have happened if my phone had died. I was hiking the full Appalachian Trail from Georgia to Maine, part of a recovery plan my therapist suggested after my deployment in Iraq. PTSD had wrecked my sleep and left me with a constant edge of anxiety. He figured being outdoors, away from all the triggers, might help settle my nervous system. I didn't think much of it at first, but the physical routine and rhythm of the trail gave me something to focus on. My pack was old but reliable, and I had every section mapped. I followed it religiously. Near Blood Mountain, about 30 days into the trip, I started to notice things that weren't right. At first, it was little stuff. A granola bar missing from my side pouch. My water filter moved from where I left it. Could have been my own carelessness, maybe just forgetfulness from the long days and nights. But it didn't feel like that. The knots I tied were tight. The gear was packed in the same way every night. Military habit. Then I noticed footprints around my campsite one morning. Smaller than mine, and they circled the tent. I hadn't heard a thing in the night. That's when the instinct kicked in. I'd felt it before, that pressure of eyes on me, like a low hum under the skin. You don't forget that once you've had it overseas. My breath would slow, and everything around me would snap into focus. It was the same feeling now. I was being tracked. I started leaving small traps. Nothing dangerous, just some loose sticks stacked a certain way, leaves spread carefully under the pack. The kind of thing that would shift if anyone came close. 3 nights in a row, something had been disturbed by morning. No animal would approach that silently and not go after the food. Whatever it was, knew to avoid the noise. That's when I began camping farther off trail, using natural cover instead of the marked clearings. Near Blood Mountain, I found a pocket of trees with thick undergrowth and barely any light coming through the canopy. No one would spot a tent in there from the trail. I stopped using my headlamp after sundown and started sleeping with my boots on. That first night in that patch of woods was calm, but I didn't sleep. Around midnight, everything went dead quiet. No crickets, no wind through the leaves, no rustling, just complete silence. I knew what that meant. In Iraq, we used to say the silence tells you more than the noise. Usually, it meant someone was nearby, a predator. I sat up slowly, didn't unzip the tent, just listened. The fire outside was almost down to embers, barely lighting a 10-foot circle around the camp. That's when I saw it. Movement at the edge of that circle. It wasn't fast. No snapping branches or heavy steps. Just a slight shift of shape between 2 tree trunks. Then stillness. I waited. Another shift. Low to the ground, maybe crouched. I moved my hand to the knife at my side. Still no sound. No breathing. I called out. "You're not fooling me." Nothing. Then, like a shadow stretching in reverse, the shape melted back into the dark. The next morning, I packed in under 10 minutes and didn't eat breakfast. I moved fast and stayed alert all day, eyes on every bend of the trail and ears tuned to every branch crack. I told myself it was probably another hiker messing around, maybe someone curious or high. But it didn't feel like that. They were deliberate. They didn't want to be seen, but they wanted me to know they were there, like a game. I hiked until after sundown and only stopped when my legs started to lock up. That night, I didn't even pitch the tent. Just wrapped myself in the bivvy and lay against a thick boulder with my back to the rock. One way in, one way out. I didn't sleep. By the time I got close to Harper's Ferry, I was running on fumes. It's a popular spot for trail hikers, usually a relief to see other people, grab supplies, and get some real food. But the feeling hadn't left. Every couple miles, I stopped and looked behind me. Nothing. But always that hum. Just after crossing the Shenandoah River, I filled my bottle and stood on the bridge for a minute, watching the water flow under the slats. Something made me look upstream. Across the water, maybe 50 yards away, was a man. Older. Hard to tell exact age from that distance, but he wore a stained green jacket and what looked like old military fatigues. His beard was thick and gray, hair long and tangled. He wasn't moving, just standing halfway behind a tree with his arms at his side, watching me. I lifted my hand and waved. He didn't wave back. I called out, "You all right?" That's when he stepped back behind the tree and vanished like smoke. I crossed the rest of the bridge fast and went off trail into the brush again. From then on, I started moving at odd hours. Night hikes, no headlamp, just moonlight when I could. Sleep during the day in tight, concealed places. That's not normal hiker behavior, but it's what we did when ambushes were likely. I started thinking this guy was maybe an old vet who'd gone off-grid. Maybe he'd been living out here, surviving in the woods, dealing with something worse than what I had. I'd met guys like that before. Friendly if you approached right, dangerous if you didn't. But what got me was the consistency. He wasn't random. He was following me. One morning in Virginia, I woke to a thump against my hammock that jolted me upright before I could process what was happening. I reached for my knife, still half asleep, but by the time my hand gripped the handle, I was looking straight into the face of a black bear. It was big. Young, maybe, but still powerful enough to do real damage. It had nudged my hammock, probably sniffing for food, but when I swung my arm hard and hit it across the snout, it let out a snort and took off into the woods without hesitation. I sat there frozen for a long time, knife still in my hand, until the forest sounds slowly came back and my heart stopped pounding. I packed up and headed down the trail without breakfast, stopping at a ranger station about a day later to report the bear. I figured they'd want to know about the animal's behavior in case it got too comfortable around hikers. The ranger didn't seem surprised. Said bears come through often, but that one might have been drawn in by the scent of food wrappers or even toothpaste. I asked if there had been any other incidents, and that's when he mentioned the man. Said there was an older guy living off-grid in that section of the forest. Former military, kept to himself, usually avoided contact. According to the ranger, he'd been on the radar for years, always moving camps, scavenging supplies from shelters after hikers left. Sometimes hikers reported hearing someone near their tents at night, or finding things slightly moved around. The rangers knew it was probably him. They'd tried to approach a few times, offer services, but he always disappeared into the trees before they could get close. "He's not violent," the ranger said. "But you never know with folks like that, especially when they've seen combat." I didn't say much after that, just nodded and moved on. In Pennsylvania, the air felt different. Wetter, heavier. Long stretches of thick forest with no cell reception and barely any hikers. One night, I camped just off the trail behind a line of tall pines, using my hammock again. I woke up in the early hours, sometime after midnight, and couldn't figure out why I was awake at first. Then I heard it. A low, constant humming noise. Mechanical. It wasn't wind, it wasn't insects, and it wasn't coming from my gear. It sounded like a distant generator, steady and unnatural in the middle of the woods. My skin prickled. The sound made the forest feel wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I grabbed my pack, didn't even bother breaking down the hammock properly, just shoved it in and started walking with my headlamp on low. I hiked for miles before the sound finally faded behind me. I didn't stop again until the sun came up. At a trail town that afternoon, I asked around at a diner about the area. An older guy at the counter leaned over and said, "That hum? That was probably the meth lab they shut down last week. Feds came through. Said it was built out past mile 73, down in a ravine near the old fire road." I told him that's exactly where I'd camped the night before. He just shook his head and said, "You're lucky. Those people don't like being seen." The same day, a younger couple hiking southbound passed me, and we exchanged notes about water sources and shelter conditions. When I mentioned the next lean-to on my map, the guy made a face. "Don't stay there," he said. "Seriously, that's the shelter where the murders happened. 2 tourists, like 5 or 6 years ago. Still unsolved." I thanked them and kept walking, but when I passed that shelter, I didn't stop. The place was clean, but too quiet. I moved another 5 miles and set up camp behind a boulder instead. After Pennsylvania, I never saw the veteran again. No more signs, no more sightings, no missing food or footprints around my camps. I thought about him often, though. Thought about the way he moved through the trees like he belonged there more than I did. I understood why he stayed out there. For some of us, coming back wasn't the same thing as returning. The world feels off. Too loud, too fast, too full of people who've never had to survive anything real. That man didn't need to explain himself. I already knew. I made it to Maine and finished the trail after 4.5 months. My body had hardened by then. The pack felt like part of me, and the woods had become something familiar. Not peaceful exactly, but honest. I still think about the people I crossed paths with. Trail angels, other hikers, that couple who warned me. But it's the veteran I remember the most. I don't know his name. Probably no one does. He didn't seem like the type who wanted to be remembered. If he's still out there, I hope he made it through another winter. Hope he found clean water and stayed warm. The rangers said he wasn't a threat, and I believe them. He wasn't out there to hurt anyone. He was just a man who couldn't live anywhere else. Some of us come home and manage to adjust. Others never really make it back. The forest doesn't care who you are or what you've done. It just lets you disappear if that's what you want. Every spring I take solo hiking trips along the Appalachian Trail with my yellow lab Max. Last year I wanted to try something different, so instead of the usual routes near hot springs or Shenandoah, I decided to explore a lesser-known side trail deep in the national forest. I parked in a gravel lot off a Forest Service road, loaded up my gear, and we started our hike around midday. The first couple of miles were uphill and slow, but the views through the pines made it worth it. After about 4 hours of hiking, we found what looked like the perfect place to set up camp. A flat clearing just above a creek bend, surrounded on 3 sides by thick pine trees, and far enough off the trail to feel completely hidden. I pitched the tent near a fallen log, unpacked my small stove, and started heating up dinner. Max chased sticks near the water, occasionally splashing into the creek and shaking off next to my pack. It was quiet in that perfect kind of way, with just the trickle of water and the rustle of wind in the trees. I didn't see a single other person all day. I'd checked the forecast before leaving. 2 clear days, no rain, low wind. Ideal conditions. After dinner, Max curled up on my sleeping pad while I read on my Kindle by headlamp. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off, Max let out a low whine and pressed against my leg. He's not the kind of dog that gets nervous. Usually he barks at any noise or runs off to investigate, but this was different. He just kept whining, pressing himself into me, like he wanted to hide inside the sleeping bag. I whispered his name and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make any noise. Max didn't budge from my side. I stepped out with the light, scanned the trees around the clearing. Everything looked still. I aimed the beam across the creek and up the ridge behind it. Nothing. Then I turned toward the direction we'd come from, back toward the trail. That's when I saw it. About 30 yards out, just barely within the range of my flashlight, there was someone standing between two trees, not moving, just standing there. I froze. The person was wearing dark clothing, maybe a hoodie or jacket, but it was hard to make out the details. They weren't holding a light, and they didn't move at all, not even when I called out. "Hey," I said, loud enough to carry. "You all right?" Nothing. No reply, no movement. Just standing there. Max was behind me now, his body pressed to the back of my legs, trembling slightly. He still hadn't barked, which made it worse. I didn't know if the person was watching us or even aware I'd seen them. I raised the light a bit to try to get a better look at their face or hands, but all I could see was a shape, a figure. They were just far enough back that the trees broke up the outline. I took a slow step forward, keeping the beam steady. "Hey," I said again, this time louder. "You need something?" Nothing. I moved a few steps closer, maybe 15 yards between us now. I could make out a little more of the outline, and I had the sense it was a man, tall, average build. Still not moving, still no reply. I looked down for just a second, to watch where I stepped over a root sticking out of the dirt, and when I looked back up, he was gone. Not walked away, gone. Just gone. 1 second he was there, the next he wasn't. My flashlight caught nothing but trees and underbrush. I stepped back toward the tent quickly, trying to keep the light moving without shaking. Max followed close, still shaking. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the woods all around the clearing, but I didn't see anything else. I waited, listening hard. No crunching leaves, no footsteps. Just the creek. I stayed outside the tent for a while, just standing with the light in my hand and the bear spray in the other. Max wouldn't leave my side. He wouldn't even sniff the air or walk a few steps to the creek. He kept pressing into me, eyes fixed on the dark. Eventually, I backed into the tent, zipped it shut, and kept the flashlight in my hand until sunrise. Max didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did I. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, even after the figure vanished. I stayed sitting up inside the tent with Max pressed against my side, his body tense, ears alert. I tried to keep my breathing slow. Every time I shifted or moved the sleeping bag, Max twitched beside me. He wasn't going to sleep, and neither was I. The forest around us had fallen back into silence, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't peaceful. I could hear the creek still flowing steadily nearby, but above that, there were occasional sounds, small things, out of place. A twig snapped directly behind the tent. Then another sound to the right, like the brushing of a coat sleeve or boot against dry branches. I froze. Max let out a low whimper, and then I heard another distinct sound. Footsteps. It wasn't an animal. I know how deer or raccoons sound when they move through the woods. This was different. Heavier. Slower. Human. It circled the tent once, keeping a perfect radius. Then again, the same pace, same path. Deliberate. I reached slowly for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to stick my hand out and shine the light. As soon as the beam hit the trees, the sound stopped. Dead silence again. No wind, no movement. Just the sound of the creek in the distance and my own breathing. I turned the light in a full circle, scanning everything. The trees stood still, unmoving. No eyeshine, no motion, no shadow. Just the same patch of forest we'd seen when we set up camp. But when I turned the light off and zipped the flap back up, the sounds started again. Back to circling, branches cracking softly under boots. It happened 3 or 4 times that night. Always the same. As soon as I unzipped the tent or moved with the light, it would stop. I started to time it. 15, 20 minutes of circling. Then silence. Then a noise from a new angle. I was sure by now that there wasn't just one person out there. I sat motionless for hours. I kept my knife unsheathed next to me and the flashlight resting on my leg. Max didn't sleep either. Every sound made his ears flick, and he'd lift his head and stare toward the tent wall, following the movement around us. Once, I thought I heard whispering. Just for a moment. Like someone speaking under their breath maybe 20 feet from us. I held Max tight and didn't move. I didn't want to make a sound. By the time the sky started to lighten, the sounds finally stopped. No more movement, no more snapping branches. Just the steady morning stillness and a few birds starting to call out in the distance. I waited a full hour before I opened the tent again. The ground was still damp with dew, but I could clearly see the marks around us. Boot prints. Dozens of them. Some old, some fresh. They formed a wide ring around the clearing, maybe 30 feet out, and then a tighter ring just 10 feet from the tent. Some came in so close they nearly touched the fabric. I crouched and looked at them carefully. The soles had a very clear tread, heavy, worn hiking boots with a thick zigzag pattern across the ball of the foot. I packed everything fast. I didn't even make coffee. Just shoved gear into the pack and kept checking over my shoulder. Max stayed close and quiet, sniffing the air. His tail was low, not wagging. He didn't bark once, and that told me enough. We got back on the trail and started hiking hard. I didn't stop until we were nearly 5 miles out and back near the main trail junction. The feeling of being watched never really left, but I didn't see anyone else the entire way out. At the trailhead, I found a ranger and told him what happened. I didn't exaggerate or make it sound dramatic. Just said I saw someone standing near my campsite in the night, didn't respond to my calls, and disappeared. Then I told him about the footprints, the circling, the sounds. The ranger listened without interrupting and finally gave a slow nod. He said it wasn't the first time they'd heard something like that. We get reports like this now and then, he told me. Usually it's nothing serious. People out here living off-grid. You'd be surprised how many just don't want to be found. I asked if it was safe to hike those side trails. He shrugged. Usually, yeah. But stick to the main routes if you're alone. More people, less chance of weird stuff. He didn't take any report, didn't write anything down. Said without identifying details, there wasn't much they could do. Max and I rested for a bit in the gravel lot near my car. I gave him water and checked his paws for cuts. I kept watching the tree line the whole time, expecting to see movement. Nothing. We don't go off trail anymore. I still take Max hiking every spring, but we stick to the main Appalachian Trail now. I bring a GPS tracker and keep my phone charged. I tell someone exactly where we're going and when we'll be back. Sometimes when we're setting up camp, Max will stop and stare into the woods for a little too long. I don't ask questions. I just keep my light close and double-check the tent zippers. That night still comes back to me sometimes. The figure standing still, the boots circling, the silence just beyond the light. I never found out who they were or what they wanted, but I know they're out there, somewhere in those woods, watching,